Section 1 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell Chesnutt. The Gooford Grapevine. Some years ago my wife was in poor health, and our family doctor, in whose skill and honesty I had implicit confidence, advised a change of climate. I shared, from an unprofessional standpoint, his opinion that the raw winds, the chill rains, and the violent changes of temperature that characterized the winters in the region of the Great Lakes tended to aggravate my wife's difficulty, and would undoubtedly shorten her life if she remained exposed to them. The doctor's advice was that we seek not a temporary place of sojourn, but a permanent residence in a warmer and more equable climate. I was engaged at the time in grape culture in northern Ohio, and as I liked the business and had given it much study, I decided to look for some other locality suitable for carrying it on. I thought of sunny France, of sleepy Spain, of Southern California, but there were objections to them all. It occurred to me that I might find what I wanted in some one of our own Southern states. It was a sufficient time after the war for conditions in the South to have become somewhat settled, and I was enough of a pioneer to start a new industry if I could not find a place where grape culture had been tried. I wrote to a cousin who had gone into the turpentine business in central North Carolina. He assured me, in response to my inquiries, that no better place could be found in the South than the state and neighborhood where he lived. The climate was perfect for health, and, in conjunction with the soil, ideal for grape culture. Labor was cheap, and land could be bought for a mere song. He gave us a cordial invitation to come and visit him while he looked into the matter. We accepted the invitation, and after several days of leisurely travel, the last 100 miles of which were up a river on a sidewheel steamer, we reached our destination, a quaint old town which I shall call Patesville, because, for one reason, that is not its name. There was a red brick market house in the public square with a tall tower, which held a four-faced clock that struck the hours, and from which there pealed out a curfew at 9 o'clock. There were 2 or 3 hotels, a courthouse, a jail, stores, offices, and all the appurtenances of a county seat and a commercial emporium. For while Patesville numbered only 4,000 or 5,000 inhabitants, of all shades of complexion, it was one of the principal towns in North Carolina, and had a considerable trade in cotton and naval stores. This business activity was not immediately apparent to my unaccustomed eyes. Indeed, when I first saw the town, there brooded over it a calm that seemed almost sabbatic in its restfulness, though I learned later on that underneath its somnolent exterior the deeper currents of life, love and hatred, joy and despair, ambition and avarice, faith and friendship, flowed not less steadily than in livelier latitudes. We found the weather delightful at that season, the end of summer, and were hospitably entertained. Our host was a man of means, and evidently regarded our visit as a pleasure, and we were therefore correspondingly at our ease, and in a position to act with the coolness of judgment desirable in making so radical a change in our lives. My cousin placed a horse and buggy at our disposal, and himself acted as our guide until I became somewhat familiar with the country. I found that grape culture, while it had never been carried on to any great extent, was not entirely unknown in the neighborhood. Several planters thereabouts had attempted it on a commercial scale in former years, with greater or less success. But, like most Southern industries, it had felt the blight of war and had fallen into desuetude. I went several times to look at a place that I thought might suit me. It was a plantation of considerable extent that had formerly belonged to a wealthy man by the name of McAdoo. The estate had been for years involved in litigation between disputing heirs, during which period shiftless cultivation had well nigh exhausted the soil. There had been a vineyard of some extent on the place, but it had not been attended to since the war, and had lapsed into utter neglect. The vines, here partly supported by decayed and broken down trellises, were twining themselves among the branches of the slender saplings which had sprung up among them, grew in wild and unpruned luxuriance, and the few scattered grapes they bore were the undisputed prey of the first comer. The site was admirably adapted to grape raising. The soil, with a little attention, could not have been better, and with the native grape, the luscious scuppernong, as my main reliance in the beginning, I felt sure that I could introduce and cultivate successfully a number of other varieties. One day I went over with my wife to show her the place. We drove out of the town over a long wooden bridge that spanned a spreading mill pond, past the long whitewashed fence surrounding the county fairground, and struck into a road so sandy that the horses' feet sank to the fetlocks. Our route lay partly uphill and partly down, for we were in the Sandhill County. We drove past cultivated farms, and then by abandoned fields grown up in scrub oak and short-leaved pine, and once or twice through the solemn aisles of the virgin forest, where the tall pines, well nigh meeting over the narrow road, shut out the sun, and wrapped us in cloistral solitude. Once, at a cross-roads, I was in doubt as to the turn to take, and we sat there waiting 10 minutes. We had already caught some of the native infection of the restlessness for some human being to come along who could direct us on our way. At length a little negro girl appeared, walking straight as an arrow, with a piggin full of water on her head. After a little patient investigation, necessary to overcome the child's shyness, we learned what we wished to know, and at the end of about 5 miles from the town reached our destination. We drove between a pair of decayed gate posts. The gate itself had long since disappeared, and up a straight sandy lane between 2 lines of rotting rail fence, partly concealed by jimson weeds and briers, to the open space where a dwelling house had once stood, evidently a spacious mansion, if we might judge from the ruined chimneys that were still standing, and the brick pillars on which the sills rested. The house itself, we had been informed, had fallen a victim to the fortunes of war. We alighted from the buggy, walked about the yard for a while, and then wandered off into the adjoining vineyard. Upon Annie's complaining of weariness, I led the way back to the yard, where a pine log, lying under a spreading elm, afforded a shady though somewhat hard seat. One end of the log was already occupied by a venerable-looking colored man. He held on his knees a hat full of grapes, over which he was smacking his lips with great gusto, and a pile of grape skins near him indicated that the performance was no new thing. We approached him at an angle from the rear, and were close to him before he perceived us. He respectfully rose as we drew near, and was moving away, when I begged him to keep his seat. "Don't let us disturb you," I said. "There is plenty of room for us all." He resumed his seat with somewhat of embarrassment. While he had been standing, I had observed that he was a tall man, and, though slightly bowed by the weight of years, apparently quite vigorous. He was not entirely black, and this fact, together with the quality of his hair, which was about 6 inches long and very bushy, except on the top of his head, where he was quite bald, suggested a slight strain of other than negro blood. There was a shrewdness in his eyes, too, which was not altogether African, and which, as we afterwards learned from experience, was indicative of a corresponding shrewdness in his character. He went on eating the grapes, but did not seem to enjoy himself quite so well as he had apparently done before he became aware of our presence. "Do you live around here?" I asked, anxious to put him at his ease. "Yas, suh. I lives dere ober yonder, behind de nex' sand hill, on de Lumberton plank road." "Do you know anything about the time when this vineyard was cultivated?" Lord bless you, suh, I knows all about it. Dey ain't nary a man in dis settlement w'at won't tell you ole Julius McAdoo was born en raised on dis yer same plantation. Is you de Norvern gentleman w'at's gwine ter buy de ole vineyard?" "I am looking at it," I replied, "but I don't know that I shall care to buy unless I can be reasonably sure of making something out of it." "Well, suh, you is a stranger to me, en I is a stranger to you, en we is bofe strangers to one anudder, but ef I 'uz in yo' place I wouldn't buy dis vineyard." "Why not?" I asked. "Well, I don't know whether you believes in conjurin' er not. Some of de w'ite folks don't, or says dey don't. But de trufe er de matter is dat dis yer ole vineyard is goophered." "Is what?" I asked, not grasping the meaning of this unfamiliar word. "Is goophered, conjured, bewitch." He imparted this information with such solemn earnestness, and with such an air of confidential mystery, that I felt somewhat interested, while Annie was evidently much impressed, and drew closer to me. "How do you know it is bewitched?" I asked. "I wouldn't 'spect fer you ter b'lieve me 'less you know all 'bout de facts, but ef you en young miss dere don't min' listenin' to a' ole nigger run on a minute er two w'ile you're restin', I kin 'splain to you how it all happened." We assured him that we would be glad to hear how it all happened, and he began to tell us. At first the current of his memory, or imagination, seemed somewhat sluggish, but as his embarrassment wore off, his language flowed more freely, and the story acquired perspective and coherence. As he became more and more absorbed in the narrative, his eyes assumed a dreamy expression, and he seemed to lose sight of his auditors, and to be living over again in monologue his life on the old plantation. "Ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo," he began, "bought dis place long many year befo' de wah, en I remember well w'en he sot out all dis yer part er de plantation in scuppernon's. De vines growed monst'us fas', en Mars Dugal' made 1,000 gallon er scuppernon wine eve'y year. Now ef dey's anything a nigger lub, nex' ter 'possum en chicken en watermillions, it's scuppernon's. Dey ain' nuffin dat kin stan' up sidin' de scuppernon fer sweetness. Sugar ain' a circumstance to scuppernon. W'en de season is nigh 'bout ober, en de grapes begin ter swivel up des a little wid de wrinkles er ole age, w'en de skin gits soft en brown, den de scuppernon make you smack yo' lip en roll yo' eye en wush fer mo'. So I reckon it ain't very 'stonishin' dat niggers loves scuppernon. Dey wuz a sight er niggers in de neighborhood er de vimya'd. Dey wuz ole Mars Henry Braboy's niggers, en ole Mars Jeems McLean's niggers, en Mars Dugal's own niggers. Den dey wuz a settlement er free niggers en po' buckras down by de Wilmington Road, en Mars Dugal's had de only vimya'd in de neighborhood. I reckon it ain't so much nowadays, but befo' de wah en slab'ry times, a nigger didn' min' goin' 5 er 10 mile in de night w'en dey wuz somethin' good to eat at de udder een'. So atter a w'ile Mars Dugal' begin to miss his scuppernon'. Co'se he 'cused de niggers er it, but dey all denied it ter de las'. Mars Dugal' sot spring guns en steel traps, en he en de oberseah sot up nights once er twice, till one night Mars Dugal', he's a monst'us keerless man, got his leg shot full er cow peas, but somehow er nudder dey couldn' nebber ketch none er de niggers. I don't know how it happened, but it happened des like I tell you, en de grapes kep' on a goin' des de same. But bimeby ole Mars Dugal' fix up a plan to stop it. Dey wuz a conjure' woman livin' down 'mongs' de free niggers on de Wilmington Road, en all de darkies from Rockfish ter Beaver Crick wuz feared er her. She could work de mos' powerfulest kin' er goopher, could make people hab fits, rheumatiz, er make 'em des dwindle away en die, en dey say she went out ridin' de niggers at night, fer she wuz a witch 'sides bein' a conjure' woman. Mars Dugal' hearn 'bout Aun' Peggy's doin's, en begun ter reflect whether er no he couldn't git her ter help him keep de niggers off'n de grapevines. One day in de spring er de year, ole Miss pack' up a basket er chicken en pound cake en a bottle er scuppernon' wine, and Mars Dugal tuck her in his buggy and drive over to Aunt Peggy's cabin. He took the basket in and had a long talk with Aunt Peggy. The next day, Aunt Peggy come up to the vineyard. The niggers seed her slipping round, and they soon found out what she was doing there. Mars Dugal had hired her to goofer the grapevines. She sat round amongst the vines and took a leaf from this one, and a grape hull from that one, and a grape seed from another one, and then a little twig from here, and a little pinch of dirt from there, and put it all in a big black bottle, with a snake's tooth and a speckled hen's gall and some hairs from a black cat's tail, and then filled the bottle with scuppernong wine. When she got the goofer all ready and fixed, she took and went out in the woods and buried it under the root of a red oak tree, and then come back and told one of the niggers she done goofer the grapevines. And every nigger what eat them grapes would be sure to die inside 12 months. After that, the niggers let the scuppernongs alone, and Mars Dugal didn't have no occasion to find no more fault. And the season was most gone when a strange gentleman stopped at the plantation one night to see Mars Dugal on some business. And his coachman, seeing the scuppernongs growing so nice and sweet, slipped round behind the smokehouse and ate all the scuppernongs he could hold. Nobody didn't notice it at the time, but that night, on the way home, the gentleman's horse runned away and killed the coachman. When we heard the news, Aunt Lucy, the cook, she up and say she see the strange nigger eating of the scuppernongs behind the smokehouse. And then we knowed the goofer had been a-working. Then one of the nigger childrens runned away from the quarters one day and got in the scuppernongs and died the next week. White folks say he died of a fever, but the niggers knowed it was the goofer. So you can be sure the darkies didn't have much to do with them scuppernong vines. When the scuppernong season was over for that year, Mars Dugal found he had made 1,500 gallons of wine, and one of the niggers heard him laughing with the overseer fit to kill, and saying them 1,500 gallons of wine was monstrous good interest on the $10 he laid out on the vineyard. So I allows he paid Aunt Peggy $10 for the goofer the grapevines. The goofer didn't work no more till the next summer, when long towards the middle of the season, one of the field hands died. And as that let Mars Dugal short of hands, he went off to town for to buy another. He fetched a new nigger home with him. He was a old nigger, the cut of a ginger cake, and bald as a hoss apple on the top of his head. He was a pert old nigger, though. He could do a big day's work. Now, it happened that one of the niggers on the next plantation, one of old Mars Henry Brayboy's niggers, had run away the day before and took to the swamp, and old Mars Dugal and some of the other neighbor white folks had gone out with the guns and the dogs for to help 'em hunt for the nigger. And the hands on our own plantation was all so flusterated that we forgot to tell the new hand about the goofer on the scuppernong vines. 'Cause he smelled the grapes and see the vines, and at the dark, the first thing he done was to slip off to the grapevines without saying nothing to nobody. Next morning he told some of the niggers about the fine bait of scuppernong he ate the night before. When they told him about the goofer on the grapevines, he is that terrified that he turned pale and looked just like he going to die right in his tracks. The overseer come up and asked what is the matter, and when they told him Henry been eating of the scuppernongs and he got goofer on him, he gin Henry a big drink of whiskey, and 'lowed that the next rainy day he'd take him over to Aunt Peggy's and see if she wouldn't take the goofer off'n him, seeing as he didn't know nothing about it till he done ate the grapes. Sure enough, it rained the next day, and the overseer went over to Aunt Peggy's with Henry. And Aunt Peggy say that being as Henry didn't know about the goofer and ate the grapes in ignorance of the consequences, she reckoned she might be able for to take the goofer off'n him. So she fetch out a bottle with some conjure medicine in it and poured some out in a gourd for Henry to drink. He managed to get it down. He say it tastes like whiskey with something bitter in it. She 'lowed that to keep the goofer off'n him till next spring, but when the sap began to rise in the grapevines, he had to come and see her again, and she tell him what else to do. Next spring, when the sap commenced to rise in the scuppernong vine, Henry took a ham one night. Where'd he get the ham, I don't know. They wasn't no hams on the plantation exceptin' what is in the smokehouse, but I never see Henry 'bout the smokehouse. But as I was sayin', he took de ham over to Aunt Peggy's, and Aunt Peggy tole him dat w'en Mars Dugal' begin to prune de grapevines, he mus' go en take en scrape off de sap where it ooze out of de cuttins of de vines, en 'noint his bald head wid it, en ef he do dat once a year, de goopher wouldn't wuk agin him long ez he done it. En bein' ez he fotch her de ham, she fix it so he kin eat all de scuppin' en he won't. So Henry gnawin' his head wid de sap out'n de big grapevine des halfway 'twixt de quarters en de big house, en de goopher nebber wuk agin him dat summer. But de beatenis' thing you eber see happen to Henry. Up to dat time he was ez bald ez a sweetened tater, but des ez soon ez de young leaves begun to come out on de grapevines, de hair begin to grow out on Henry's head, en by de middle of de summer he had de biggest head of hair on de plantation. Befo' dat, Henry had tol'able good hair roun' de edges, but soon ez de young grapes begin to come, Henry's hair begin to curl all up in little balls des like his here reg'lar grappy hair, en by de time de grapes got ripe his head look des like a bunch of grapes. Combin' it didn't do no good. He wuk at it half de night wid a Jim Crow, en think he git it straighten out, but in de mawnin de grapes 'ud be dere des de same. So he gin it up, en tried to keep de grapes down by havin' his hair cut short. Footnote: a small card, resembling a currycomb in construction, and used by negroes in the rural districts instead of a comb. End footnote. But dat wa'n't de queerest thing about de goopher. When Henry come to the plantation, he was gettin' a little old and stiff in the joints. But dat summer he got des as spry and lively as any young nigger on the plantation. Fac', he got so biggity dat Mars Jackson, de overseer, had to th'eaten to whip him ef he didn't stop cuttin' up his dittos and behave hisse'f. But de mos' cur'ous thing happened in de fall, when de sap begin to go down in de grapevines. Fus', when de grapes is gethered, de knots begin to straighten out in Henry's hair, and when de leaves begin to fall, Henry's hair 'mence' to drap out. And when de vines is bare, Henry's head was baldder dan it was in de spring, and he begin to get old and stiff in de joints again, and paid no mo' 'tention to de gals durin' de whole winter. And nex' spring, when he rubbed de sap on again, he got young again, and so supple and lively dat none of de young niggers on de plantation couldn't jump, ner dance, ner hoe ez much cotton as Henry. But in de fall of de year his grapes 'mence' to straighten out, and his joints to get stiff, and his hair drap off, and de rheumatic begin to wrestle wid him. Now ef you'd 'a' knowed ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo, you'd 'a' knowed dat it had to be a mighty rainy day w'en he couldn't find somethin' fer his niggers to do, and it had to be a mighty little hole he couldn't crawl th'ough, and had to be a monst'us cloudy night w'en a dollar git by him in de darkness. And w'en he see how Henry git young in de spring and ole in de fall, he 'lowed ter hisse'f ez how he could make mo' money out'n Henry dan by wukkin' him in de cotton fiel'. 'Long de nex' spring, atter de sap 'mence' to rise en Henry gnawed his head en started fer to git young en supple, Mars Dugal' up en tuk Henry to town en sole 'im fer $1,500. Co'se de man w'at bought Henry didn't know nuffin 'bout de goopher, en Mars Dugal' didn't see no 'casion fer to tell 'im. 'Long to'ds de fall, w'en de sap went down, Henry begun to git old agin, same ez usual, en his new marster begun to git scared less'n he gwine lose his $1,500 nigger. He sent fer a mighty fine doctor, but de medicine didn't 'pear to do no good. De goopher had a good holt. Henry tole de doctor 'bout de goopher, but de doctor des laugh at him. One day in de winter, Mars Dugal' went to town, en was santerin' 'long de main street w'en who should he meet but Henry's new marster. Dey said howdy, en Mars Dugal' ax' him ter hab a seegyar. En atter dey run on a while 'bout de craps en de weather, Mars Dugal' ax' him sorter careless, like ez ef he des thought of it, "How you like de nigger I sole you las' spring?" Henry's marster shuck his head en knocked de ashes off'n his seegyar. "'Spec' I made a bad bargain w'en I bought dat nigger. Henry done good wuk all de summer, but sence de fall set in he 'pears ter be sorter pinin' away. Dey ain' nuffin pertic'lar de matter wid 'im, leas'ways de doctor say so, 'ceptin' a tech er de rheumatiz, but his hair is all fell out, and if he don't pick up his strength mighty soon, I spec I'm gwine to lose him.' Dey smoked on a while, and by ole Mars say, 'Well, a bargain's a bargain, but you and me is good friends, and I don't want to see you lose all the money you paid for that nigger, and if what you say is so, and I ain't sputting it, he ain't wuth much now. I specs you worked him too hard this summer, or else the swamps down here don't agree with the sand hill nigger. So you just let me know, and if he gets any wusser, I'll be willing to give you $500 for him, and take my chances on his living.' Sho' 'nuff, when Henry begun to draw up wid de rheumatiz, and it looked like he gwine to die fer sho', his new marster sent fer Mars Dugal', and Mars Dugal' give him w'at he promus', and brung Henry home agin. He took good care of him durin' the winter, give him whiskey to rub his rheumatiz and tobacco to smoke, and all he want to eat, 'cause a nigger w'at he could make $1,000 a year off'n didn't grow on every huckleberry bush. Next spring, when the sap rise and Henry's hair commenced to sprout, Mars Dugal' sol' him again down in Robeson County dis time, and he kep' dat sellin' business up fer 5 year or mo'. Henry neber say nuffin 'bout de goopher to his new masters, 'cause he know he gwine to be took good care of de next winter when Mars Dugal' buy him back, and Mars Dugal' made 'nuff money off'n Henry to buy anudder plantation ober on Beaver Crick. But long 'bout de end of dat 5 year, dey come a stranger to stop at de plantation. De fus day he 'uz here, he went out wid Mars Dugal' and spent all de mornin' lookin' ober de vineyard, and atter dinner dey spent all de evenin' playin' kyards. De niggers soon 'skivered dat he wuz a Yankee, and dat he come down to Norf Car'lina fer to learn de w'ite folks how to raise grapes and make wine. He promised Mars Dugal' he could make the grape vines bear twice as many grapes, and dat the new wine press he was a sellin' would make mo' d'n twice as many gallons of wine. And ole Mars Dugal' jes' drunk it all in, jes' 'peared to be bewitched by dat Yankee. When the darkies see dat Yankee runnin' roun' de vineyard and diggin' under de grape vines, dey shook their heads, and 'lowed dat dey feared Mars Dugal' losin' his min'. Mars Dugal' had all de dirt dug away from under de roots of all de scuppernum vines, and let 'em stand dat way fer a week or mo'. Den dat Yankee made de niggers fix up a mixtry of lime and ashes and manure, and pour it roun' de roots of de grape vimes. Den he advised Mars Dugal' fer to trim de vimes closet, and Mars Dugal' tuck and done eve'ything de Yankee tole him to do. Durin' all dis time, min' you, dis yer Yankee wuz livin' off'n de fat er de lan' at de big house, and playin' kyards wid Mars Dugal' eve'y night, and dey say Mars Dugal' los' more'n $1,000 durin' de week dat Yankee wuz a ruinin' de grape vimes. When the sap rise next spring, ole Henry 'nointed his head as usual, and his hair commenced to grow des de same as it done every year. De scuppernum vimes growed monst'us fas', and de leaves was greener and thicker dan dey eber been durin' my remembrance. And Henry's hair growed out thicker dan eber, and it 'peared to get younger and younger, and suppler and suppler. And seein' as he was short of hands dat spring, havin' took in considerable new ground, Mars Dugal' concluded he wouldn't sell Henry till he git de crap in and de cotton chop, so he kep' Henry on de plantation. But long 'bout time fer de grapes to come on de scuppernum vimes, dey 'peared to come a change ober 'em. De leaves withered and swivel up, and de young grapes turned yeller, and by everybody on de plantation could see dat de whole vineyard was dyin'. Mars Dugal' tuck and watered de vimes and done all he could, but it wa'n't no use. Dat Yankee had done bust a watermelon. One time de vines picked up a bit, and Mars Dugal' 'lowed dey was gwine come out agin, but dat Yankee done dug too close under de roots, and pruned de branches too close to de vine, and all dat lime and ashes done burnt de life out'n de vimes, and dey des keep a witherin' and a swivelin'. All dis time de goopher was a workin'. When de vimes started to wither, Henry 'mence to complain of his rheumatiz, and when de leaves begin to dry up, his hair 'mence to drap out. When de vimes fresh up a bit, Henry'd get peart agin, and when de vimes withered agin, Henry'd get ole agin, and des kep' gittin' mo' and mo' fittin' fer nuffin. He des pined away, and finally tuck to his cabin, and when de big vine, whar he got de sap to 'noint his head, withered and turned yellow and died, Henry died too. Just went out sort of like a candle. They didn't appear to be nothing matter with him, excepting the rheumatiz, but his strength just dwindled away till he didn't have enough left to draw his breath. The goofer had got on the boat and throwed Henry that time for good and all. Mars Dugal took on mightily about losing his vimes and his nigger in the same year, and he swore that if he could get hold of that Yankee, he'd wear him to a frazzle, and then chaw up the frazzle. And he done it, too, for Mars Dugal's a monstrous brash man when he once gets started. He sought the vineyard out over again, but it was 3-4 years before the vimes got to bearing any scuppernings. When the war broke out, Mars Dugal raised a company and went off to fight the Yankees. He say he was mighty glad that war come, and he does want to kill a Yankee for every dollar he lost long of that grape-raising Yankee. And I expect he would have done it, too, if the Yankees hadn't suspicioned something and killed him first. After the surrender, old Miss moved to town. The niggers all scattered away from the plantation, and the vineyard ain't been cultivated since. "Is that story true?" asked Annie doubtfully, but seriously, as the old man concluded his narrative. "It's just as true as I'm a-sitting here, miss. There's a easy way to prove it. I can lead the way right to Henry's grave over yonder in the plantation burying ground. And I'll tell you what, massa, I wouldn't advise you to buy this here old vineyard, 'cause the goofer's on it yet, and there ain't no telling when it's going to crap out. But I thought you said all the old vines died." "They did appear to die, but a few of 'em come out again, and is mixed in 'mongst the others. I ain't scared to eat the grapes, 'cause I knows the old vines from the new ones. But with strangers, there ain't no telling what might happen. I wouldn't advise you to buy this vineyard." I bought the vineyard, nevertheless, and it has been for a long time in a thriving condition, and is often referred to by the local press as a striking illustration of the opportunities open to Northern capital in the development of Southern industries. The luscious scuppernong holds first rank among our grapes, though we cultivate a great many other varieties, and our income from grapes packed and shipped to the Northern markets is quite considerable. I have not noticed any developments of the goofer in the vineyard, although I have a mild suspicion that our colored assistants do not suffer from want of grapes during the season. I found when I bought the vineyard that Uncle Julius had occupied a cabin on the place for many years, and derived a respectable revenue from the product of the neglected grapevines. This doubtless accounted for his advice to me not to buy the vineyard, though whether it inspired the goofer story I am unable to state. I believe, however, that the wages I paid him for his services as coachman, for I gave him employment in that capacity, were more than an equivalent for anything he lost by the sale of the vineyard. End of the Goofered Grapevine. Section 2 of The Conjure Woman, by Charles Waddell Chesnutt. Poe Sandy. On the northeast corner of my vineyard, in central North Carolina, and fronting on the Lumberton Plank Road, there stood a small frame house of the simplest construction. It was built of pine lumber, and contained but one room, to which one window gave light, and one door admission. Its weather-beaten sides revealed a virgin innocence of paint. Against one end of the house, and occupying half its width, there stood a huge brick chimney. The crumbling mortar had left large cracks between the bricks. The bricks themselves had begun to scale off in large flakes, leaving the chimney sprinkled with unsightly blotches. These evidences of decay were but partially concealed by a creeping vine, which extended its slender branches hither and thither in an ambitious but futile attempt to cover the whole chimney. The wooden shutter, which had once protected the unglazed window, had fallen from its hinges, and lay rotting in the rank grass and jimson weeds beneath. This building, I learned when I bought the place, had been used as a schoolhouse for several years prior to the breaking out of the war, since which time it had remained unoccupied, save when some stray cow or vagrant hog had sought shelter within its walls from the chill rains and nipping winds of winter. One day my wife requested me to build her a new kitchen. The house, erected by us when we first came to live upon the vineyard, contained a very conveniently arranged kitchen, but for some occult reason my wife wanted a kitchen in the backyard, apart from the dwelling house, after the usual Southern fashion. Of course, I had to build it. To save expense, I decided to tear down the old schoolhouse, and use the lumber, which was in a good state of preservation, in the construction of the new kitchen. Before demolishing the old house, however, I made an estimate of the amount of material contained in it, and found that I would have to buy several hundred feet of lumber additional, in order to build the new kitchen according to my wife's plan. One morning old Julius McAdoo, our colored coachman, harnessed the gray mare to the rockaway, and drove my wife and me over to the sawmill from which I meant to order the new lumber. We drove down the long lane which led from our house to the plank road. Following the plank road for about a mile, we turned into a road running through the forest and across the swamp to the sawmill beyond. Our carriage jolted over the half-rotted corduroy road which traversed the swamp and then climbed the long hill leading to the sawmill. When we reached the mill, the foreman had gone over to a neighboring farmhouse, probably to smoke or gossip, and we were compelled to await his return before we could transact our business. We remained seated in the carriage, a few rods from the mill, and watched the leisurely movements of the mill hands. We had not waited long before a huge pine log was placed in position. The machinery of the mill was set in motion, and the circular saw began to eat its way through the log, with a loud whir, which resounded throughout the vicinity of the mill. The sound rose and fell in a sort of rhythmic cadence, which, heard from where we sat, was not unpleasing, and not loud enough to prevent conversation. When the saw started on its second journey through the log, Julius observed in a lugubrious tone, and with a perceptible shudder, but dat just do cuddle my blood." "What's the matter, Uncle Julius?" inquired my wife, who is of a very sympathetic turn of mind. "Does the noise affect your nerves?" "No, Miss Annie," replied the old man with emotion, "I ain' nervous, but dat saw, a cuttin' and grindin' th'ough dat stick er timber, and moanin' and groanin' and sweekin', kyars my 'memb'ance back to ole times, and minds me of po' Sandy." The pathetic intonation with which he lengthened out the "po' Sandy" touched a responsive chord in our own hearts. "And who was poor Sandy?" asked my wife, who takes a deep interest in the stories of plantation life which she hears from the lips of the older colored people. Some of these stories are quaintly humorous, others wildly extravagant, revealing the oriental cast of the negro's imagination, while others, poured freely into the sympathetic ear of a Northern-bred woman, disclose many a tragic incident of the darker side of slavery. "Sandy," said Julius, replying to my wife's question, "was a nigger what used to belong to old Mars Marrabo McSwain. Mars Marrabo's place was on the other side of the swamp, right next to yo' place. Sandy was a monstrous good nigger, and could do so many things there about the plantation, and allers tend to his work so well, that when Mars Marrabo's chilluns growed up and married off, dey all of 'em wanted dey daddy fer to gin 'em Sandy for a weddin' present. But Mars Marrabo knowed the rest wouldn't be satisfied if he gin Sandy to e'er one of 'em. So when dey was all done married, he fix it by 'lowin' one of his chilluns to take Sandy fer a month er so, and den anudder fer a month er so, and so on dat a way till dey had all had 'em the same lenk er time. And den dey would all take 'em roun' ag'in, 'ceptin' oncet in a while when Mars Marrabo would len' 'em to some er his other kinfolks roun' the country, when dey was short er hands, till bimeby it got so Sandy didn't hardly know where he was gwine ter stay fum one week's end ter the other. One time, when Sandy was lent out as usual, a speculator come along wid a lot er niggers, and Mars Marrabo swapped Sandy's wife off fer a new woman. When Sandy come back, Mars Marrabo gen him $1 and 'lowed he was monstrous sorry for the breakup of the family, but the speculator had gen him big boot, and times was hard and money scarce, and so he was bleedst to make a trade. Sandy took on some 'bout losin' his wife, but he soon seed dey wa'n't no use cryin' ober spilt molasses, and bein' as he lacked the looks of the new woman, he tuk up wid her atter she be'n on the plantation a month or so. Sandy and his new wife got on mighty well tergedder, and the niggers all 'mence' ter talk about how lovin' dey wuz. W'en Tenie was took sick oncet, Sandy useter set up all night wid her, and den go ter work in de mornin' des like he had his reg'lar sleep, and Tenie would 'a' done anythin' in de worl' fer her Sandy. Sandy and Tenie hadn't been livin' tergedder fer mo' d'n 2 months befo' Mars Marrabo's ole uncle, w'at lived down in Robeson County, sent up ter fin' out ef Mars Marrabo couldn't len' him or hire him a good han' fer a month er so. Sandy's marster was one er dese yer easy goin' folks w'at wanter please eve'ybody, en he says yes, he could len' him Sandy. En Mars Marrabo tol' Sandy fer ter git ready ter go down ter Robeson nex' day fer ter stay a month er so. It was monst'us hard on Sandy fer ter take him away from Tenie. It was so fur down to Robeson dat he didn't have no chance er comin' back ter see her till de time was up. He wouldn't 'a' min' comin' 10 or 15 mile at night ter see Tenie, but Mars Marrabo's uncle's plantation was mo' d'n 40 mile off. Sandy was mighty sad en cas' down atter w'at Mars Marrabo tol' him, en he says ter Tenie, sezee, 'I'm gittin' monst'us tired er dish yer gwine roun' so much. Here I is lent ter Mars Jeems dis month, en I got ter do so en so, en ter Mars Archie de nex' month, en I got ter do so en so, den I got ter go ter Miss Jenny's. En it's Sandy dis en Sandy dat, en Sandy yer en Sandy dere, till it 'pears ter me I ain' got no home, ner no marster, ner no mistress, ner no nuffin. I can't even keep a wife. My other ole woman was sole away widout my gittin' a chance fer ter tell her good bye, en now I got ter go off en leave you, Tenie, en I don't know whether I'm eber gwine ter see you ag'in, en no I wish I wuz a tree, er a stump, or a rock, er sump'n w'at could stay on de plantation fer a while." Atter Sandy got th'oo talkin', Tenie didn't say na'er a word, but des sat dere by de fire studyin' en studyin'. Bimeby she up en says, "Sandy, is I eber tole you I was a conjure woman?" Co'se, Sandy hadn't neber dreamt er nuffin like dat, en he made a great 'miration w'en he hear w'at Tenie say. Bimeby Tenie went on, "I ain' goofed nobody, ner done no conjure work fer 15 year er mo', en w'en I got religion I made up my min' I wouldn't work no mo' goofer. But dey is some things I don't believe is no sin fer ter do. En ef you don't wanter be sent roun' fum pillar ter pos', en ef you don't wanter go down ter Robeson, I kin fix things so you won't hafter. Ef you'll des say de word, I kin turn you ter whatever you wanter be, en you kin stay right whar you wanter, ez long ez you min' ter." Sandy say he don't care, he's willin' fer ter do anything fer ter stay close ter Tenie. Den Tenie ax him ef he don't wanter be turnt into a rabbit. Sandy say, "Nah, de dogs mought git atter me." "Shall I turn you to a wolf?" says Tenie. "Nah, eve'ybody's scared er a wolf, en I don't want nobody ter be scared er me." "Shall I turn you to a mockingbird?" "Nah, a hawk mought ketch me. I wanter be turnt inter sump'n w'at'll stay in one place." "I kin turn you to a tree," says Tenie. "You won't hab no mouf ner years, but I kin turn you back oncet in a w'ile, so you kin git sump'n ter eat, en hear w'at's gwine on." Well, Sandy say dat'll do, en so Tenie tuk him down by de edge er de swamp, not fur fum de quarters, en turnt him into a big pine tree, en sot him out 'mongst some other trees. En de nex' mornin', ez some er de fiel' han's wuz gwine 'long dere, dey seed a tree w'at dey didn't 'member er habbin' seed befo'. It was monst'us queer, en dey wuz bleedst ter 'low dat dey hadn't 'membered right, er else one er de saplings had be'n growin' monst'us fas'. W'en Mars Marrabo 'skivered dat Sandy wuz gone, he 'lowed Sandy had run away. He got the dogs out, but the last place they could track Sandy to was the foot of that pine tree. And there the dogs stood and barked and bayed and pawed at the tree and tried to climb up on it. And when they was took round through the swamp to look for the scent, they broke loose and made for that tree again. It was the beatin'est thing the white folks ever hearn of, and Mars Marrabo 'lowed that Sandy must have climbed up on the tree and jump off on a mule or something and rid fur enough for to spoil the scent. Mars Marrabo wanted to 'cuse some of the other niggers of helping Sandy off, but they all nighted to the last, and everybody knowed Tenny sot too much store by Sandy for to help him run away while she couldn't never see him no more. When Sandy had been gone long enough for folks to think he done got clean away, Tenny used to go down to the woods at night and turn him back, and then they'd slip up to the cabin and set by the fire and talk. But they had to be monstrous careful, or else somebody would have seed 'em, and that would have spoilt the whole thing. So Tenny allers turned Sandy back in the morning early, before anybody was a-stirring. But Sandy didn't get along without his trials and tribulations. One day a woodpecker come along and minced a peck at the tree, and the next time Sandy was turns back, he had a little round hole in his arm, just like a sharp stick been stuck in it. After that, Tenny sot a sparrowhawk fer to watch the tree, and when the woodpecker come along next morning fer to finish his nest, he got gobbled up most 'fore he stuck his bill in the bark. 'Nuther time, Mars Marrabo sent a nigger out in the woods fer to chop turpentine boxes. The man chop a box in dish here tree and hack the bark up 2 or 3 feet fer to let the turpentine run. The next time Sandy was turnt back, he had a big scar on his left leg, just like it been skunt. And it took Tenny nigh about all night fer to fix a mixtry to cure it up. After dat, Tenny sot a haunted fer to watch the tree, and when the nigger come back again fer to cut another box on the other side of the tree, the haunted stung him so hard that the axe slipped and cut his foot nigh about off. When Tenny see so many things happening to the tree, she 'cluded she had to turn Sandy to somethin' else, and after studyin' the matter over and talkin' with Sandy one evenin', she made up her mind fer to fix up a goopher mixtry what would turn herself and Sandy to foxes, or somethin', so they could run away and go somewheres where they could be free and live like white folks. But they ain't no tellin' what's gwine happen in this world. Tenny had got the night sot fer her and Sandy to run away, when that very day one of Mars Marrabo's sons rid up to the big house in his buggy, and say his wife was monstrous sick, and he want his mammy to lend him a woman fer to nuss his wife. Tenny's mistress say send Tenny, she was a good nuss. Young Mars was in a terrible hurry fer to get back home. Tenny was washin' at the big house that day, and the mistress say she should go right along with her young massa. Tenny tried to make some 'scuse fer to get away and hide till night, when she would have everything fixed up fer her and Sandy. She say she want to go to her cabin fer to get her bonnet. Her mistress say it don't matter about the bonnet. Her head hanker was good enough. Den Tenny say she want to get her best frock. Her mistress say no, she don't need no mo' frock, and when that one got dirty, she could get a clean one where she was going. So Tenny had to get in the buggy and go 'long with young Mars Duncan to his plantation, which was mo' d'n 20 mile away, and they wa'n't no chance of her seeing Sandy no mo' till she come back home. The po' gal felt monstrous bad 'bout the way things was going on, and she knowed Sandy must be a wonderin' why she didn't come turnin' back no mo'. Whiles Tenny was away nussin' young Mars Duncan's wife, Mars Marrabo took a notion fer to build him a new kitchen, and bein' as he had lots of timber on his place, he begun to look roun' for a tree to have the lumber sawed out'n. And I don't know how it come to be so, but it happened fer to hit on the very tree what Sandy was turns into. Tenny was gone, and they wa'n't nobody ner nuffin fer to watch the tree. The 2 men what cut the tree down say they never had such a time with a tree befo'. They axes would glance off, and didn't 'pear to make no progress through the wood. And of all the creakin' and shakin' and wobblin' you eber see, that tree done it when it commenced to fall. It was the beatin'est thing. When they got the tree all trim up, they chain it up to a timber wagon and start for the sawmill. But they had a hard time getting a log there. First, they got stuck in the mud when they was going across the swamp, and it was 2 or 3 hours before they could get it out. When they start on again, the chain kept a coming loose, and they had to keep a stopping for to hitch the log up again. When they commenced to climb the hill to the sawmill, the log broke loose and rolled down the hill in amongst the trees, and it took nigh about half a day more to get it hauled up to the sawmill. The next morning, after the day the tree was hauled to the sawmill, Tenny come home. When she got back to her cabin, the first thing she done was to run down to the woods and see how Sandy was getting on. When she seed the stump standing there, with the sap running out in it and the limbs laying scattered round, she nigh about went out in her mind. She run to her cabin and got a gopher mixture, and then followed the track of the timber wagon to the sawmill. She knowed Sandy couldn't live more than a minute or so if she turns him back, for he was all chop up, so he'd have been bleached to die. But she wanted to turn him back long enough for to explain to him that she hadn't went off a purpose and left him to be chopped down and sawed up. She didn't want Sandy to die with no hard feelings towards her. The hands at the sawmill had just got the big log on the carriage and was starting up the saw when they seed a woman running up the hill, all out of breath, crying and going on just like she was plumb 'stracted. It was Tenny. She come right into the mill and throwed herself on the log, right in front of the saw, a hollering and crying to her Sandy to forgive her and not to think hard of her, for it wasn't no fault of hern. Then Tenny 'membered the tree didn't have no years, and she was getting ready for to work her gopher mixture so as to turn Sandy back, when the mill hands cotch hold of her and tied her arms with a rope and fastened her to one of the posts in the sawmill. And then they started to saw up again and cut the log up into boards and scantlings right before her eyes. But it was mighty hard work, for of all the squeaking and moaning and groaning, that log done it whiles the saw was a-cutting through it. The saw was one of these here old-timey up-and-down saws, and it took longer them days to saw a log than it do now. They greased the saw, but that didn't stop the fuss. It kept right on, till finally they got the log all sawed up. When the overseer would run the sawmill come from breakfast, the hands up and tell him about the crazy woman, as they s'posed she was, what had come running in the sawmill, a-hollering and going on, and tried to throw herself before the saw. And the overseer sent 2 or 3 of the hands for to take Tenny back to her master's plantation. Tenny appeared to be out in her mind for a long time, and her master had to lock her up in the smokehouse till she got over her spells. Mars Marrabo was monstrous mad, and it would have made your flesh crawl for to hear him cuss, 'cause he say the speculator what he got Tenny from had fooled him by working a crazy woman off on him. Whilst Tenny was locked up in the smokehouse, Mars Marrabo took and hauled the lumber from the sawmill and put up his new kitchen. When Tenny got quiet down so she could be 'lowed to go round the plantation, she up and told her master all about Sandy and the pine tree. And when Mars Marrabo hearn it, he 'lowed she was the worst 'stracted nigger he ever hearn of. He didn't know what to do with Tenny. First he thought he'd put her in the po'house, but finally, seeing as she didn't do no harm to nobody nor nuffin, but just went around moaning and groaning and shaking her head, he 'cluded to let her stay on the plantation and nuss the little nigger chilluns when they mammies was to work in the cotton field. The new kitchen Mars Marrabo built wasn't much use, for it hadn't been put up long before the niggers 'mence to notice queer things about it. They could hear something moaning and groaning about in the kitchen in the night time, and when the wind would blow, they could hear something a-hollering and squeaking like it was in great pain and suffering. And it got so after a while that it was all Mars Marrabo's wife could do to get a woman to stay in the kitchen in the daytime long enough to do the cooking. And there wasn't nary nigger on the plantation what wouldn't rudder take 40 than to go about that kitchen after dark. That is, 'ceptin' Tenny. She didn't 'pear to mind the ha'nts. She used to slip round at night and set on the kitchen steps and lean up against the door jamb and run on to herself with some kind of foolishness what nobody couldn't make out, for Mars Marrabo had threatened to send her off in the plantation if she say anything to any of the other niggers about the pine tree. But somehow or other the niggers found out all about it, and they all knowed the kitchen was haunted by Sandy's spirit. And by it got so Mars Marrabo's wife herself was scared to go out in the yard after dark. When it come to that, Mars Marrabo took and tore the kitchen down, and used the lumber for to build that old schoolhouse what you were talking about pulling down. The schoolhouse was in use 'ceptin' in the daytime, and on dark nights folks going 'long the road would hear queer sounds and see queer things. Po' old Tenny used to go down there at night and wander around the schoolhouse, and the niggers all 'lowed she went for to talk with Sandy's spirit. In one winter morning, when one of the boys went to school early for to start the fire, what should he find but po' old Tenny laying on the floor, stiff and cold and dead. There didn't 'pear to be nuffin particular the matter with her. She had just grieved herself to death for her Sandy. Mars Marrabo didn't shed no tears. He thought Tenny was crazy, and they wa'n't no telling what she might do next. And there ain't much room in this world for crazy white folks, let alone a crazy nigger. It wa'n't long after that before Mars Marrabo sold a piece of his tract of land to Mars Dugal McAdoo, my old master, and that's how the old schoolhouse happened to be on yo' place. When the war broke out, the school stopped, and the old schoolhouse been standing empty ever since, that is, 'cep'n for the ha'nts. And folks says that the old schoolhouse, or any other house what got any of that lumber in it what was sawed out in the tree what Sandy was turned into, is going to be haunted till the last piece of plank is rotted and crumble into dust. Annie had listened to this gruesome narrative with strained attention. What a system it was, she exclaimed, when Julius had finished, under which such things were possible. What things? I asked in amazement. Are you seriously considering the possibility of a man's being turned into a tree? Oh, no, she replied quickly. Not that. And then she murmured absently, and with a dim look in her fine eyes, Poor Tenny. We ordered the lumber and returned home. That night, after we had gone to bed, and my wife had to all appearances been sound asleep for half an hour, she startled me out of an incipient doze by exclaiming suddenly, "John, I don't believe I want my new kitchen built out of the lumber in that old schoolhouse." "You wouldn't for a moment allow yourself," I replied with some asperity, "to be influenced by that absurdly impossible yarn which Julius was spinning to day." "I know the story is absurd," she replied dreamily, "and I am not so silly as to believe it. But I don't think I should ever be able to take any pleasure in that kitchen if it were built out of that lumber. Besides, I think the kitchen would look better and last longer if the lumber were all new." Of course, she had her way. I bought the new lumber, though not without grumbling. A week or two later I was called away from home on business. On my return, after an absence of several days, my wife remarked to me, "John, there has been a split in the Sandy Run Colored Baptist Church on the temperance question. About half the members have come out from the main body, and set up for themselves. Uncle Julius is one of the seceders, and he came to me yesterday and asked if they might not hold their meetings in the old schoolhouse for the present." "I hope you didn't let the old rascal have it," I returned with some warmth. I had just received a bill for the new lumber I had bought. "Well," she replied, "I couldn't refuse him the use of the house for so good a purpose." "And I'll venture to say," I continued, "that you subscribed something toward the support of the new church?" She did not attempt to deny it. "What are they going to do about the ghost?" I asked, somewhat curious to know how Julius would get around this obstacle. "Oh," replied Annie, "Uncle Julius says that ghosts never disturb religious worship, but that if Sandy's spirit should happen to stray into meeting by mistake, no doubt the preaching would do it good." End of Poe Sandy. Section 3 of The Conjure Woman, Ma's Jeem's Nightmare. We found old Julius very useful when we moved to our new residence. He had a thorough knowledge of the neighborhood, was familiar with the roads and the watercourses, knew the qualities of the various soils and what they would produce, and where the best hunting and fishing were to be had. He was a marvelous hand in the management of horses and dogs, with whose mental processes he manifested a greater familiarity than mere use would seem to account for, though it was doubtless due to the simplicity of a life that had kept him close to nature. Toward my tract of land and the things that were on it, the creeks, the swamps, the hills, the meadows, the stones, the trees, he maintained a peculiar personal attitude that might be called predial rather than proprietary. He had been accustomed, until long after middle life, to look upon himself as the property of another. When this relation was no longer possible, owing to the war and to his master's death and the dispersion of the family, he had been unable to break off entirely the mental habits of a lifetime, but had attached himself to the old plantation, of which he seemed to consider himself an appurtenance. We found him useful in many ways and entertaining in others, and my wife and I took quite a fancy to him. Shortly after we became established in our home on the sandhills, Julius brought up to the house one day a colored boy of about 17, whom he introduced as his grandson, and for whom he solicited employment. I was not favorably impressed by the youth's appearance, quite the contrary, in fact. But mainly to please the old man I hired Tom, his name was Tom, to help about the stables, weed the garden, cut wood and bring water, and in general to make himself useful about the outdoor work of the household. My first impression of Tom proved to be correct. He turned out to be very trifling, and I was much annoyed by his laziness, his carelessness, and his apparent lack of any sense of responsibility. I kept him longer than I should, on Julius's account, hoping that he might improve, but he seemed to grow worse instead of better, and when I finally reached the limit of my patience, I discharged him. "I am sorry, Julius," I said to the old man. "I should have liked to oblige you by keeping him, but I can't stand Tom any longer. He is absolutely untrustworthy." "Yes, sir," replied Julius, with a deep sigh and a long shake of the head. "I knows he ain't much account, and dey ain't much dependence to be put on him, but I was hoping dat you mought make some allowance for a ignorant young nigger, sir, and give him one mo' chance." But I had hardened my heart. I had always been too easily imposed upon, and had suffered too much from this weakness. I determined to be firm as a rock in this instance. "No, Julius," I rejoined decidedly, "it is impossible. I gave him more than a fair trial, and he simply won't do." When my wife and I set out for our drive in the cool of the evening (afternoon is evening in Southern parlance), one of the servants put into the rockaway 2 large earthenware jugs. Our drive was to be down through the swamp to the mineral spring at the foot of the sandhills beyond. The water of this spring was strongly impregnated with sulphur and iron, and while not particularly agreeable of smell or taste, was used by us in moderation for sanitary reasons. When we reached the spring we found a man engaged in cleaning it out. In answer to an inquiry, he said that if we would wait 5 or 10 minutes, his task would be finished, and the spring in such condition that we could fill our jugs. We might have driven on and come back by way of the spring, but there was a bad stretch of road beyond, and we concluded to remain where we were until the spring should be ready. We were in a cool and shady place. It was often necessary to wait a while in North Carolina, and our Northern energy had not been entirely proof against the influences of climate and local custom. While we sat there, a man came suddenly around a turn of the road ahead of us. I recognized in him a neighbor with whom I had exchanged formal calls. He was driving a horse, apparently a high-spirited creature, possessing, so far as I could see at a glance, the marks of good temper and good breeding. The gentleman, I had heard it suggested, was slightly deficient in both. The horse was rearing and plunging, and the man was beating him furiously with a buggy whip. When he saw us, he flushed a fiery red, and as he passed, held the reins with one hand, at some risk to his safety, lifted his hat, and bowed somewhat constrainedly as the horse darted by us, still panting and snorting with fear. "He looks as though he were ashamed of himself," I observed. "I'm sure he ought to be," exclaimed my wife indignantly. "I think there is no worse sin, and no more disgraceful thing than cruelty." "I quite agree with you," I assented. "A man what 'buses his hoss is gwine to be hard on the folks what works for him," remarked Julius. "If young Mr. McLean don't mind, he'll have a bad dream one dese yer days, jes' like his gran'daddy had, way back yonder, long years befo' the wah." "What was it about Mr. McLean's dream, Julius?" I asked. The man had not yet finished cleaning the spring, and we might as well put in time listening to Julius as in any other way. We had found some of his plantation tales quite interesting. "Mars Jeems McLean," said Julius, "was de gran'daddy of dis yer gentleman w'at is jes' gone by us beatin' his hoss. He had a big plantation and a heap of niggers. Mars Jeems was a hard man, and monst'us strict wid his hands. Eber sence he growed up, he neber 'peared to have no feelin' fer nobody. W'en his daddy, ole Mars John McLean, died, de plantation and all de niggers fell to young Mars Jeems. He had be'n bad enough befo', but it wa'n't long afterwards till it got so dey wuz no use in libbin' at all ef you had ter lib roun' Mars Jeems. His niggers wuz bleedzd to slave from daylight to dark, w'iles the yuther folks didn' have ter work 'cep'n' from sun to sun. En dey didn' git no mo' ter eat dan dey oughter, en dat de coarsest kin'. Dey wa'n't 'lowed ter sing, ner dance, ner play de banjo w'en Mars Jeems wuz roun' de place, fer Mars Jeems say he wouldn't have no sech gwines on. Said he bought his hands ter wuk, en not ter play. En w'en night come, dey mus' sleep en res', so dey'd be ready ter git up soon in de mawnin' en go ter wuk fresh en strong. Mars Jeems didn' 'low no co'tin' er junesin' roun' his plantation. Said he wanted his niggers ter put dey minds on dey wuk, en not be wastin' dey time wid no sech foolishness. En he wouldn' let his hands git mad. Said he wa'n't raisin' niggers, but wuz raisin' cotton. En w'eneber any er de boys en gals had 'mence' ter git sweet on one anudder, he'd sell one er de udder of 'em, er sen' 'em way down in Robeson County ter his udder plantation, whar dey couldn't neber see one anudder. Ef any er de niggers eber complained, dey got 40. So, co'se dey didn' many un 'em complain. But dey didn't lack it, des de same, en nobody couldn't blame 'em, fer dey had a hard time. Mars Jeems didn't make no 'lowance fer nat'ral bawn laziness, ner sickness, ner trouble in de min', ner nuffin. He wuz des gwine git so much wuk out er eve'y han', er know de reason why. Dey wuz one time de niggers 'lowed fer a spell dat Mars Jeems might git better. He tuk a likin' ter Mars Marrabo McSwain's oldest gal, Miss Libbie, en useter go ober dere eve'y day er eve'y evenin', en folks said dey wuz gwine git married sho'. But it 'pears dat Miss Libbie heard 'bout de gwines on Mars Jeems' plantation, en she des 'lowed she couldn't trus' herse'f wid no sech a man; dat he might git so useter 'busin' his niggers dat he'd 'mence ter 'buse his wife atter he got useter havin' her roun' de house. So she declared she wa'n't gwine have nuffin mo' ter do wid young Mars Jeems. De niggers wuz all monst'us sorry w'en de match wuz bus' up, fer now Mars Jeems got wusser'n he wuz befo' he sta'ted sweetheartin'. De time he useter spen' co'tin' Miss Libbie, he put in findin' fault wid de niggers, en all his bad feelin's 'cause Miss Libbie throwed him ober, he 'peared ter try ter wuk off on de po' niggers. W'iles Mars Jeems wuz co'tin' Miss Libbie, two er de hands on de plantation had got ter settin' a heap er sto' by one anudder. One of 'em wuz name' Solomon, en de udder wuz a 'oman w'at wuked in de fiel' longer'n I am. I fergit dat 'oman's name, but it don't 'mount ter much in de tale nohow. Now, whether cause Mars Jeems was so tuck up with his own Junesy, footnote, sweetheart, end footnote, that it didn't pay no attention for a while to what was going on 'twixt Solomon and his Junesy, or whether his own courting made him kind of easy on the courting in the quarters, they ain't no telling. But there's one thing sure, that when Miss Libby throwed him over, he found out about Solomon and the gal monstrous quick, and gunned Solomon 40, and sent the gal down to the Robeson County plantation and told all the niggers if he catch him at any more such foolishness, he was going to skin 'em alive and tan their hides before their very eyes. 'Course, he wouldn't have done it, but it might have made things worse than they was. So you can imagine they wasn't much love making in the quarters for a long time. Mars Jeems used to go down to the other plantations sometimes for a week or more, and so he had to hire an overseer to look after his work while he's gone. Mars Jeems' overseer was a poor white man named Nick Johnson. The niggers called him Mars Johnson to his face, but behind his back they used to call him Old Nick, and the name suited him to a T. He was worse than Mars Jeems ever dared to be. 'Course, the darkies didn't like the way Mars Jeems used him, but he was the master, and had a right to do as he pleased. But this here Old Nick wasn't nothing but a po' buckra, and all the niggers spies him as much as they hated him, for he didn't own nobody, and wasn't no better than a nigger, for in them days any 'spectable person would rather be a nigger than a po' white man. Now after Solomon's gal had been sent away, he kept feeling mo' and mo' bad about it, till finally he 'lowed he was going to see if they couldn't be something done fer to get her back, and to make Mars Jeems treat the darkies better. So he took a peck of cotton out the barn one night and went over to see old Aunt Peggy, the free nigger Cajun woman down by the Wilmington Road. Aunt Peggy listened to his tale and asked him some questions, and then told him she would work her roots and see what they'd say about it, and tomorrow night he should come back again and fetch another peck of corn, and then she'd have something for to tell him. So Solomon went back the next night, and sure enough Aunt Peggy told him what to do. She gun him some stuff what looked like it been made by pounding up some roots and yerbs with a pestle and a mortar. "This here stuff," says she, "is monstrous powerful kind of goofer. You take this home and gin it to the cook, if you can trust her, and tell her for to put it in your master's soup the first cloudy day he have okra soup for dinner. Mind you follow the directions. It ain't going to poison him, is it?" Solomon getting kind of scared, for Solomon was a good man, didn't want to do nobody no real harm. "Oh, no," says old Aunt Peggy, "it's going to do him good, but he'll have a monstrous bad dream first. A month from now you come down here and let me know how the goofer is working, for I ain't done much of this kind of conjuring of late years, and I has to kind of keep track on it to see that it don't accomplish no more than I allows for it to do. And I has to be kind of careful about conjuring white folks, so be sure and let me know whatever you do, just what is going on around the plantation." So Solomon say all right, and took the goofer mixture up to the big house, and gun it to the cook, and told her for to put it in Mars Jeems' soup the first cloudy day she have okra soup for dinner. It happened that the very next day was a cloudy day, and so the cook made okra soup for Mars Jeems' dinner, and put the powder Solomon gun her into the soup, and made the soup real good, so Mars Jeems did a whole lot of it, and 'peared to enjoy it. The next morning Mars Jeems told the overseer he was going away on some business, and then he was going to his other plantation down in Robeson County, and he didn't expect he'd be back for a month or so. "But," says he, "I want you to run this here plantation for all it's worth. These here niggers is getting monstrous trifling and lazy and careless, and there ain't no dependence to be put in 'em. I wants that stop, and whiles I'm going away, I wants the 'spenses cut way down and a heap mo' work done. Fact, I want this here plantation to make a record that'll show what kind of overseer you is." Old Nick didn't say nuffin but "Yes, sir," but the way he kind of grinned to himself and show his big yeller teeth and snapped a rawhide he used to carry around with him made cold chills run up and down the backbone of them niggers what heard Mars Jeems a talking. And that night they was moaning and groaning down in the quarters, for the niggers all know what was coming. So, sure enough, Mars Jeems went away next morning, and the trouble begun. Mars Johnson started off the very first day for to see what he could have to show Mars Jeems when he come back. He made the task bigger and the rations littler, and when the niggers had worked all day, he'd find something for to do round the barn or somewheres after dark, for to keep 'em busy an hour or so before they went to sleep. About 3 or 4 days after Mars Jeems went away, young Mars Duncan McSwain rode up to the big house one day with a nigger sitting behind him in the buggy, tied to the seat, and asked if Mars Jeems was home. Mars Johnson was at the house, and he say no. "Well," says Mars Duncan, says he, "I fotched this nigger over to Mr. McLean for to pay a bet I made with him last week when we was playing cards together. I bet him a nigger man, and here's one I reckon 'll fill the bill. He was took up the other day for a stray nigger, and he couldn't give no count of hisself, and so he was sold at auction, and I bought him. He's kind of brash, but I knows your powers, Mr. Johnson, and I reckon if anybody can make 'em toe the mark, you is the man." Mars Johnson grinned one of them grins which show all his snagger teeth, and make the niggers 'low he looked like the old Deborah, and says he to Mars Duncan, "I reckon you can trust me, Mr. Duncan, for to tame any nigger was ever born. The nigger don't live what I can't take down in 'bout 4 days." Well, old Nick had his hands full longer that new nigger, and whiles the rest of the darkies was sorry for the po' man, they 'lowed he kept Mars Johnson so busy dat they got along better than they'd 'a' done ef the new nigger had never come. The first thing that happened, Mars Johnson says to this yer new man, "What's your name, Sambo?" "My name ain't Sambo," spoke the new nigger. "Did I ax you what your name wasn't?" says Mars Johnson. "You wants to be particular how you talks to me. Now what is your name, and where did you come from?" "I don't know my name," says the nigger, "and I don't 'member where I come from. My head is all kind of mixed up." "Yas," says Mars Johnson, "I reckon I'll have to give you something fer to cle'r your head. At the same time it'll learn you some manners, and after this maybe you'll say 'suh' when you speaks to me." Well, Mars Johnson haul off with his rawhide and hit the new nigger once. The new man look at Mars Johnson for a minute as if he didn't know what to make of this here kind of learning. But when the overseer raised his whip to hit him again, the new nigger just haul off and made for Massa Johnson, and if some of the other niggers hadn't stopped him, it appears as if it might have made it warm for old Nick there for a while. But the overseer made the other niggers help tie the new nigger up, and then gun him 40, with a dozen or so throwed in for good measure, for old Nick was never stingy with them kind of rations. The nigger went on at a terrible rate, just like a wild man, but 'cause he was bleedzed to take his medicine, for he was tied up and couldn't help himself. Massa Johnson locked the new nigger up in the barn, and didn't give him nuffin to eat for a day or so, till he got him kind of quiet down. Then he tu'nt him loose and put him to work. The nigger 'lowed he wa'n't used to workin', and wouldn't work, and Mars Johnson gun him another 40 for laziness and impudence, and let him fast a day or so mo', and then put him to work again. The nigger went to work, but didn't 'pear to know how to handle a hoe. It took just 'bout half the overseer's time looking after him, and that po' nigger got mo' lashings and cussings and cuffings than any 4 others on the plantation. He didn't mix with nor talk much to the rest of the niggers, and couldn't 'pear to get it through his mind that he was a slave, and had to work and mind the white folks, spite of the fact that old Nick gun him a lesson every day. And finally Mars Johnson 'lowed that he couldn't do nuffin with him, that if he was his nigger he'd break his spirit or break his neck, one or the other. But 'course he was only sont over on trial, and as he didn't give satisfaction, and he hadn't heard from Mars Jeems 'bout when he was comin' back, and as he was feared he'd get mad some time or 'nother and kill a nigger before he knowed it, he 'lowed he'd better send him back where he come from. So he tied him up and sont him back to Mars Duncan. Now, Mars Duncan McSwain was one of these here easy-going gentlemen, what didn't like to hate no trouble with niggers or nobody else, and he knowed if Mars old Nick couldn't get along with his nigger, nobody could. So he took the nigger to town that same day and sold him to a trader what was getting up a gang of likely niggers for to ship off on the steamboat to go down the river to Wimbledon and from there to New Orleans. The next day, after the new man had been sent away, Solomon was working in the cotton field, and when he got to the fence next to the woods, at the end of the row, who should he see on the other side but old Aunt Peggy. She beckoned to him, the overseer was down on the other side of the field, and says she, "Why ain't you done come and ported to me like I told you?" "Why, Lord, Aunt Peggy," says Solomon, "dey ain't nuffin to port. Mars Jeems went away day after we gun him the goopher mixtry, and we ain't seen hide nor hair on him since. En co'se we don't know nuffin 'bout w'at 'fect it had on him. I don't care nuffin 'bout yo' Mars Jeems now. W'at I wants to know is w'at has been gwine on 'mongst the niggers. Has you been gettin' 'long any better on the plantation?" "No, Aunt Peggy, we been gettin' 'long wusser. Mars Johnson is stricker'n he eber was befo', en de po' niggers don't hardly get time to draw dey breff, en dey 'lows dey might des ez well be dead ez alive." "Uh-huh," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "I tole you dat is monst'us powerful goopher, en its wuk don't 'pear all at once. Long ez we had dat new nigger here," Solomon went on, "he kep' Mars Johnson busy part de time, but now he's gone away, I s'pose de res' un us'll ketch it wusser'n eber." "W'at's gone wid de new nigger?" says Aunt Peggy, rale quick, battin' her eyes en straightening up. "Ole Nick done sont 'im back ter Mars Dunkin, who had fotch 'im here fer ter pay a gamblin' debt ter Mars Jeems," says Solomon, "en I hear Mars Dunkin has sol' 'im to a nigger trader up in Patesville, w'at's gwine ter ship 'im off wid a gang termorrer." Ole Aunt Peggy 'peared ter get rale stirred up w'en Solomon tole her dat, en says she, shaking her stick at him, "Why didn't you come en tell me 'bout dis new nigger bein' sol' away? Didn't you promise me ef I give you dat goopher, you'd come en 'pote ter me 'bout all w'at's gwine on dis plantation? Co'se I could 'a' foun' out fer myse'f, but I 'pended on yo' tellin' me, en now by not doin' it, I's feared you gwine spile my cunju'n. You come down ter my house ter night en do w'at I tells you, or I'll put a spell on you dat'll make yo' hair fall out so you'll be bald, en yo' eyes drap out so you can't see, en yo' teeth fall out so you can't eat, en yo' years grow up so you can't hear. When you is foolin' wid a cunjuh woman like me, you gotter min' yo' P's en Q's, or dere'll be trouble sho' 'nuff." So, co'se, Solomon went down to Aunt Peggy's dat night, en she gun 'im a roasted sweet'n 'tater. "You take dis yer sweet'n 'tater," says she. "I done goophered it specially fer dat nigger, so you bet not eat it yo'self or you'll wish you hadn't. En slip off ter town en fin' dat strange man en give 'im dis yer sweet'n 'tater. He mus' eat it befo' mornin' sho', ef he don't wanter be sol' away ter New Orleans." "But s'posen the patty rollers ketch me, Aunt Peggy, w'at I gwine ter do?" says Solomon. "De patty rollers ain' gwine tech you, but ef you don't fin' dat nigger I'm gwine git you, en you'll fin' me wusser'n de patty rollers. Des hol' on a minute, en I'll sprinkle you wid some er dis mixtry out'n dis yer bottle, so de patty rollers can't see you, en you kin rub yo' feet wid some er dis yer grease out'n dis gourd, so you kin run fas', en rub some of it in yo' eyes so you kin see in de dark. En den you mus' fin' dat new nigger en give 'im dis yer 'tater, or you're gwine ter hab mo' trouble on yo' hands dan you eber had befo' in yo' life, or eber will hab sence." So Solomon tuk de sweet'n 'tater en sta'ted up de road fas' ez he could go, en befo' long he retch town. He went right along by de patty rollers, en dey didn't 'pear ter notice 'im, en bimeby he foun' whar de strange nigger was kep', en he walk' right pas' de guard at de do' en foun' 'im. De nigger couldn't see 'im, of co'se, en he couldn't 'a' seen de nigger in de dark ef it hadn' be'n fer de stuff Aunt Peggy gun 'im ter rub on his eyes. De nigger was layin' in a cornder, 'sleep, en Solomon des slip' up to 'im en hilt dat sweet'n 'tater 'fo' de nigger's nose, en he des natchully retch up wid his han' en tuk de 'tater en eat it in his sleep widout knowin' it. W'en Solomon seed he done eat de 'tater, He went back and told Aunt Peggy, and then went home to his cabin to sleep, way long 'bout 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day was Sunday, and so the niggers had a little time to theirselves. Solomon was kinder 'sturbed in his mind thinking 'bout his Junesy what is gone away, and wondering what Aunt Peggy had to do with that new nigger, and he had sauntered up in the woods so's to be by hisself a little, and at the same time to look at the rabbit trap he'd sot down in the edge of the swamp, when who should he see standing under a tree but a white man. Solomon didn't know the white man at first, till the white man spoke up to him. "Is that you, Solomon?" says he. Then Solomon recognized the voice. "For the law's sake, Mars Jeems, is that you?" "Yes, Solomon," says his master, "dis is me, er what's left of me." It wasn't no wonder Solomon hadn't known Mars Jeems at first, for he was dressed like a po' white man, and was barefooted, and looked monstrous pale and peaked, as if he'd just come through a hard spell of sickness. "You are lookin' kinder po'ly, Mars Jeems," says Solomon. "Is you be'n sick, suh?" "No, Solomon," says Mars Jeems, shaking his head and speaking sorter slow and sad, "I ain' be'n sick, but I's had a monst'us bad dream. Fac', a reg'lar natchul nightmare. But tell me how things has be'n gwine up to the plantation sence I be'n gone, Solomon." So Solomon up and tol' him 'bout the crops, en 'bout the hosses en the mules, en 'bout the cows en the hogs, en w'en he 'mence ter tell him 'bout the new nigger, Mars Jeems prick up his years en listen, en eve'y now en den he say, "Uh-huh, mm-huh," en nod his head, en bimeby, w'en he'd ax Solomon some mo' questions, he says he, "Now, Solomon, I don't want you to say a word to nobody 'bout meetin' me here, but I want you to slip up to the house and fetch me some clothes and some shoes. I forgot to tell you that a man robbed me back yonder on the road and swapped clothes with me without axing me whether or no. But you neenter say nuffin about that nuther. You go and fetch me some clothes here, so nobody won't see you, and keep your mouth shut, and I'll give you $1." Solomon was so 'stonished he lack ter fell over in his tracks when Mars Jeems promised to give him $1. Dey suttinly was a change come over Mars Jeems w'en he offer one of his niggers dat much money. Solomon 'mence ter 'spec' dat Aunt Peggy's cunjation had be'n wukkin' monst'us strong. Solomon fotch Mars Jeems some clothes en shoes, en dat same ebenin' Mars Jeems 'peared at de house en let on like he des dat minute got home from Robeson County. Mars Johnson was all ready to talk to him, but Mars Jeems sont him word he wa'n't feelin' ve'y well dat night, en he'd see him termorrer. So nex' mawnin', atter breakfas', Mars Jeems sont fer de oberseer, en ax' him fer ter give 'count er his stewardship. Ole Nick tol' Mars Jeems how much work be'n done, en got de books en showed him how much money be'n save'. Den Mars Jeems ax' him how de darkies be'n behavin', en Mars Johnson say dey be'n behavin' good, most of 'em, en dem w'at didn't behave good at fus' changed dey conduc' atter he got holt of 'em a time er two. "All," says he, "'cep'n de new nigger Mr. Duncan fotch over here en lef' on trial w'iles you wuz gone." "Ah, yas," 'lows Mars Jeems. "Tell me all 'bout dat new nigger. I heard a little 'bout dat quare new nigger las' night, en it wuz des too ridic'lous. Tell me all 'bout dat new nigger." So, seein' Mars Jeems so good natured 'bout it, Mars Johnson up en tol' him how he tied up de new han' de fus' day, en gun him 40 'ca'se he wouldn't tell him his name. "Ha, ha, ha!" says Mars Jeems, laughin' fit ter kill, "but dat is too funny fer any use. Tell me some mo' 'bout dat new nigger." So Mars Johnson went on en tol' him how he had ter starbe de new nigger 'fo' he could make 'im take holt er a hoe. "Dat wuz de beatenis' notion fer a nigger," says Mars Jeems, puttin' on airs des like he wuz a w'ite man, "en I reckon you didn' do nuffin ter 'im." "Oh, no, suh," says de oberseer, grinnin' like a cheesy cat, "I didn' do nuffin but take de hide off'n 'im." Mars Jeems laughed en laughed, till it 'peared like he wuz gwine ter bus'. "Tell me some mo' 'bout dat new nigger, oh, tell me some mo'. Dat new nigger int'rusts me, he do, en dat is a fac'." Mars Johnson didn't quite understand why Mars Jeems should make such a great moderation about the new nigger, but course he want to please the gentleman would hired him, and so he explained all about how many times he had to cowhide the new nigger, and how he made him do tasks twice as big as some of the other hands, and how he'd chain him up in the barn at night and feed him on cornbread and water. "Oh, but you was a monstrous good overseer. You was the best overseer in this county, Mr. Johnson," says Mars Jeems, when the overseer got through with his tale. "And dey ain't neber been no nigger breaker like you round here befo'. And you deserves great credit for sending that nigger away before you spilt him for the market. Fact, you was such a monstrous good overseer, and you has got this here plantation in such fine shape that I reckon I don't need you no mo'. You has got these here darkies so well trained that I spec I can run 'em myself from this time on. But I does wish you had a hilt on to that new nigger till I got home, for I'd a liked to seed him, I certainly should." The overseer was so 'stonished he didn't hardly know what to say, but finally he asked Mars Jeems if he wouldn't give him a recommend for to get him another place. "No, suh," says Mars Jeems. "Somehow or 'nother I don't like yo' looks sence I come back this time, and I'd much ruther you wouldn't stay round here. Fact, I's feared if I'd meet you alone in the woods sometime I mought want to harm you. But layin' that aside, I been lookin' over these here books of yourn what you kep' while I was away, and for a year or so back, and there's some figures what ain't jest clear to me. I ain't got no time fer to talk about 'em now, but I 'spect before I settles wid you fer this last month, you better come up here termorrer after I's looked the books and counts over some more, and then we'll straighten our business all up." Mars Jeems 'lowed afterwards dat he was jes' shootin' in the dark w'en he said dat 'bout the books, but howsomeber, Mars Nick Johnson lep dat neighborhood 'twixt de nex' 2 suns, and nobody round here neber seed hidin' a hair of 'em sence. And all the darkies thanked the Lawd and 'lowed it was a good riddance of bad rubbage. But all dem things I done tol' you ain't nuffin 'cidin' de change w'at come over Mars Jeems from dat time on. Aunt Peggy's goopher had made a new man of 'im entirely. De nex' day atter he come back, he tol' de hands dey needn't ter work only from sun to sun, and he cut dey tasks down so dey didn't nobody have ter stan' over 'em wid a rawhide or a hickory. And he 'lowed ef de niggers wanter hab a dance in de big barn any Sad'day night, dey mought hab it. And bimeby, w'en Solomon seed how good Mars Jeems was, he ax' him ef he wouldn' please sen' down ter de other plantation fer his junesey. Mars Jeems say suttinly, en gun Solomon a pass en a note ter de overseer on de other plantation, en sont Solomon down ter Robeson County wid a hoss en buggy fer ter fetch his junesey back. W'en de niggers see how fine Mars Jeems gwine treat 'em, dey all tuk ter sweetheartin' en juneseying en singin' en dancin', en 8 or 10 couples got married, en bimeby eve'ybody 'mence ter say Mars Jeems McLean got a finer plantation en slicker lookin' niggers, en dat he is makin' mo' cotton en corn dan any other gentleman in de county. En Mars Jeems' own junesey, Miss Libby, heard 'bout de new gwines on Mars Jeems' plantation, en she changed her min' 'bout Mars Jeems en tuk 'im back ag'in, en 'fo' long dey had a fine weddin', en all de darkies had a big feas', en dey was fiddlin' en dancin' en funnin' en frolickin' fum sundown ter mawnin'. "And they all lived happy ever after," I said, as the old man reached a full stop. "Yes, suh," he said, interpreting my remarks as a question. "They did. Solomon used ter say," he added, "dat Aunt Peggy's goopher had turnt Mars Jeems to a nigger, en dat new hen was Mars Jeems hisse'f. But co'se Solomon didn't dast ter let on 'bout w'at he 'spicioned, en ole Aunt Peggy would 'a' 'nied it ef she had be'n axed, fer she'd 'a' got in trouble sho' ef it 'uz knowed she'd be'n conjurin' de w'ite folks. Dis yer tale goes ter show," concluded Julius sententiously, as the man came up and announced that the spring was ready for us to get water, "dat w'ite folks w'at is so hard en stric' en don't make no 'lowance fer po' ign'ant niggers w'at ain' had no chance ter l'arn, is liable ter hab bad dreams, ter say de leas', en dat dem w'at is kin' en good ter po' people is sho' ter prosper en git 'long in de worl'." "That is a very strange story, Uncle Julius," observed my wife, smiling, "and Solomon's explanation is quite improbable." "Yes, Julius," said I, "that was powerful goopher. I am glad, too, that you told us the moral of the story. It might have escaped us otherwise. By the way, did you make that up all by yourself?" The old man's face assumed an injured look, expressive more of sorrow than of anger, and shaking his head, he replied, "No, suh. I heared dat tale befo' you er Miss Annie dere was bawn, suh. My mammy tole me dat tale w'en I wa'n't mo' d'n knee high to a hoppergrass." I drove to town next morning on some business, and did not return until noon, and after dinner I had to visit a neighbor, and did not get back until supper time. I was smoking a cigar on the back piazza in the early evening, when I saw a familiar figure carrying a bucket of water to the barn. I called my wife. "My dear," I said severely, "what is that rascal doing here? I thought I discharged him yesterday for good and all." "Oh, yes," she answered, "I forgot to tell you. He was hanging round the place all the morning, and looking so down in the mouth that I told him that if he would try to do better, we would give him one more chance. He seemed so grateful and so really in earnest in his promises of amendment that I'm sure you'll not regret taking him back." I was seriously enough annoyed to let my cigar go out. I did not share my wife's rose colored hopes in regard to Tom, but as I did not wish the servants to think there was any conflict of authority in the household, I let the boy stay. End of Mars Jeems's Nightmare. Section 4 of The Conjure Woman. The Conjurer's Revenge. Sunday was sometimes a rather dull day at our place. In the morning, when the weather was pleasant, my wife and I would drive to town, a distance of about 5 miles, to attend the church of our choice. The afternoons we spent at home, for the most part occupying ourselves with the newspapers and magazines, and the contents of a fairly good library. We had a piano in the house, on which my wife played with skill and feeling. I possessed a passable baritone voice, and could accompany myself indifferently well when my wife was not by to assist me. When these resources failed us, we were apt to find it a little dull. One Sunday afternoon in early spring, the balmy spring of North Carolina, when the air is in that ideal balance between heat and cold where one wishes it could always remain, my wife and I were seated on the front piazza, she wearily but conscientiously plowing through a missionary report, while I followed the impossible career of the blonde heroine of a rudimentary novel. I had thrown the book aside in disgust, when I saw Julius coming through the yard, under the spreading elms which were already in full leaf. He wore his Sunday clothes, and advanced with a dignity of movement quite different from his week day slouch. "Have a seat, Julius," I said, pointing to an empty rocking chair. "No, thank you, boss. I'll just sit here on the top step." "Oh, no, Uncle Julius," exclaimed Annie. "Take this chair. You will find it much more comfortable." The old man grinned in appreciation of her solicitude, and seated himself somewhat awkwardly. "Julius," I remarked, "I am thinking of setting out scuppernong vines on that sandhill where the 3 persimmon trees are. And while I'm working there, I think I'll plant watermelons between the vines, and get a little something to pay for my first year's work. The new railroad will be finished by the middle of summer, and I can ship the melons north, and get a good price for them." "If you're going to have any mo' plowing to do," replied Julius, "I 'spect you'll have to buy another creature, 'cause it's much as dem hosses can do to 'tend to the work dey got now." "Yes, I had thought of that. I think I'll get a mule. A mule can do more work, and doesn't require as much attention as a horse." "I wouldn't 'vise you to buy no mule," remarked Julius, with a shake of his head. "Why not?" "Well, You may 'low it's all foolishness, but if I was in yo' place, I wouldn't buy no mule.' "'But that isn't a reason. What objection have you to a mule?' "'Fac' is,' continued the old man in a serious tone, 'I don't lack ter drive a mule. I's alluz feared I mought be imposin' on some human creetur. Eve'y time I cuts a mule wid a hickory, 'pears ter me mos' lackly I's cuttin' some er my own relations, er somebody else w'at can't he'p deirselves.' "'What put such an absurd idea into your head?' I asked. My question was followed by a short silence, during which Julius seemed engaged in a mental struggle. 'I don't know ez it's wuth w'ile ter tell you dis,' he said at length. 'I don't hardly 'spec fer you ter believe it. Does you 'member dat club-footed man w'at helt de hoss fer you de yuther day, w'en you was gittin' out er de rockaway down ter Mars Archie McMillan's sto'?' "'Yes, I believe I do remember seeing a club-footed man there.' "'Did you eber see a club-footed nigger befo' er sence?' "'No, I can't remember that I ever saw a club-footed colored man,' I replied after a moment's reflection. "'You and Miss Annie wouldn't wanter b'lieve me ef I wuz ter 'low dat dat man wuz oncet a mule.' "'No,' I replied, 'I don't think it very likely that you could make us believe it.' "'Why, Uncle Julius,' said Annie severely, 'what ridiculous nonsense!' This reception of the old man's statement reduced him to silence, and it required some diplomacy on my part to induce him to vouchsafe an explanation. The prospect of a long, dull afternoon was not alluring, and I was glad to have the monotony of Sabbath quite relieved by a plantation legend. "When I was a young man," began Julius, when I had finally prevailed upon him to tell us the story, "dat club-footed nigger, his name is Primus, used ter belong to ole Mars Jim McGee ober on de Lumberton Plank Road. I used ter go ober dere ter see a 'oman w'at libbed on de plantation. Dat's how I come ter know all erbout it. Dis yer Primus wuz de liveliest han' on de place, alluz a dancin' en drinkin' en runnin' roun' en singin' en pickin' de banjo. 'Cep'n once in a w'ile, w'en he'd 'low he wa'n't treated right 'bout somethin' er anudder, he'd git so sulky en stubborn dat de w'ite folks couldn't hardly do nuffin wid 'im. It wuz 'gin de rules fer any er de hands ter go 'way fum de plantation at night, but Primus didn' min' de rules, en went w'en he felt lack it. En de w'ite folks p'ten' lack dey didn' know it, fer Primus wuz dangerous w'en he got in dem stubborn spells, en dey'd ruther not fool wid 'im. One night, in de spring er de year, Primus slip' off fum de plantation en went down on de Wim'l'ton Road to a dance gun by some er de free niggers down dere. Dey wuz a fiddle en a banjo en a jug gwine roun' on de outside, en Primus sung en danced till 'long 'bout 2 o'clock in de mawnin', w'en he start fer home. As he come along back, he tuk a nigh cut 'cross de cotton fields en 'long by de edge er de mineral spring swamp, so as ter git shut er de patter rollers w'at rid up en down de big road fer ter keep de darkies from runnin' roun' nights. Primus wuz santerin' 'long studyin' 'bout de good time he'd had wid de gals, w'en as he wuz gwine by a fence conder, w'at should he hear but somethin' grunt. He stopped a minute ter listen, en he heard somethin' grunt ag'in. Den he went ober ter de fence whar he heard de fuss, en dere layin' in de fence conder, on a pile er pine straw, he seed a fine, fat shote. Primus look' hard at de shote, en den sta'ted home. But somehow er udder he couldn't git away fum dat shote. W'en he tuk one step for'ards wid one foot, de yuther foot 'peared ter take 2 steps backards, en so he kep' natchully gittin' closeter en closeter ter de shote. It wuz de beatenis' thing. De shote des 'peared ter charm Primus, en fus' thing you know, Primus foun' hisse'f way up de road wid de shote on his back. Ef Primus had 'a knowed whose shote dat wuz, he'd 'a' managed ter git pas' it somehow er 'nudder. As it happen', de shote b'longed to a cunjuh man w'at libbed down in de free nigger settlement. Co'se, de cunjuh man didn' hab ter wuk his roots but a little while 'fo' he foun' out who tuk his shote, en den de trouble begun. One mawnin', a day er so later, en befo' he got de shote eat up, Primus didn' go ter wuk w'en de hawn blow, en w'en de oberseer went ter look fer 'im, There wasn't no trace of Primus to be discovered nowhere. When he didn't come back in a day or so more, everybody on the plantation allowed he'd run away. His master advertised him in the papers and offered a big reward for him. The nigger catchers fotch out the dogs and track him down to the edge of the swamp, and then the scent gun out, and that was the last anybody see the Primus for a long, long time. 2 or 3 weeks after Primus disappeared, his master went to town one Sunday. Mars Jim was standing in front of Sandy Campbell's bar room up by the old wagon yard, when a po' white man from down on the Wilmington Road come up to him and asked him kind of careless like if he didn't want to buy a mule. "I don't know," says Mars Jim. "It depends on the mule and on the price. Where's the mule?" "Just round here, back of old Tom McAllister's store," says the po' white man. "I reckon I'll have a look at the mule," says Mars Jim, "and if it suit me, I don't know but what I might buy him." So the po' white man took Mars Jim round back of the store, and there stood a monstrous fine mule. When the mule see Mars Jim, he gun a whinny, just like he knowed him before. Mars Jim look at the mule, and the mule 'peared to be sound and strong. Mars Jim 'lowed dey 'peared to be something familiar 'bout the mule's face, 'specially his eyes, but he hadn't lost nary mule, and didn't have no recommembrance of having seen the mule before. He asked the po' buckra where he got the mule, and the po' buckra say his bruh raised the mule down on Rockfish Creek. Mars Jim was a little suspicious of seeing a po' white man with such a fine creature, but he finally agreed to give the man $50 for the mule, 'bout half what a good mule was wuth dem days. He tied the mule behind the buggy when he went home, and put him to plowing cotton the next day. The mule done mighty well for 3 or 4 days, and then the niggers 'mence to notice some queer things about him. There was a meadow on the plantation where they used to put the horses and mules to pasture. It was fenced off from the cornfield on one side, but on the other side of the pasture was a tobacco patch where it wa'n't fenced off, 'cause the beastuses done none of 'em eat tobacky. They don't know what's good. Tobacco is like religion. The good Lawd made it for people, and they ain't no other creature what can 'preciate it. The darkies noticed that the fust thing the new mule done, when he was turned into the pasture, was to make for the tobacco patch. 'Course they didn't think nuffin on it, but next mornin', when they went to ketch him, they discovered that he'd eat up 2 whole rows of tobacco plants. Atter dat they had to put a halt on him, and tie him to a stake, or else they wouldn't 'a' been nary a leaf of tobacco left in the patch. Another day, one of the hands, named Dolphus, hitched a mule up and drive up here to the vineyard. That was when old Mars Dugal owned this place. Mars Dugal had kilt a yearlin', and the neighbor white folks all sont over fer to git some fresh meat, and Mars Jim had sont Dolphus fer some too. There was a wine press in the yard where Dolphus left the mule standing, and right in front of the press there was a tub of grape juice, just pressed out, and a little to one side a barrel about half full of wine what had been standing 2 or 3 days, and had begun to get sort of sharp to the taste. There was a couple of boards on top of this here barrel with a rock laid on 'em to hold 'em down. As I was saying, Dolphus left the mule standing in the yard and went into the smokehouse fer to get the beef. By when he come out, he seed the mule was staggerin' 'bout the yard, and 'fo' Dolphus could git there to find out what was the matter, the mule fell right over on his side and laid there just like he was dead. All the niggers 'bout the house run out there fer to see what was the matter. Some say the mule had the colic, some say one thing and some another, till by one of the hands seed the top was off of the barrel and run and looked in. "'Fo' de Lawd,' he say, 'dat mule drunk, he been drinkin' the wine.' And sho' 'nuff de mule had passed right by the tub of fresh grape juice and pushed the cover off'n the barrel and drunk 2 or 3 gallon of the wine what had been standing long enough fer to begin to get sharp. The darkies all made a great 'miration 'bout the mule gettin' drunk. They never hadn't seen nuffin like it in dey bawn days. They poured water over the mule and tried to sober him up, but it wa'n't no use, and Dolphus had to take the beef home on his back and leave the mule there till he slep off his spree. I don't 'member whether I told you or not, but when Primus disappeared from the plantation, he left a wife behind him, a monstrous good-looking yaller gal named Sally. When Primus had been gone a month or so, Sally 'mence fer to get lonesome, and took up wid another young man named Dan, what belonged on the same plantation. One day dis yer Dan took de new mule out in de cotton field fer to plow, en when dey was gone 'long de turn row, who should he meet but dis yer Sally. Dan look roun' en he didn' see de oberseer nowhar, so he stop' a minute fer to run on wid Sally. "'Howdy, honey,' sez he. 'How you feelin' dis mawnin'?' "'Fus' rate,' 'spon' Sally. Dey was lookin' at one anudder, en dey didn' na'er one of 'em pay no attention ter de mule, who had tu'nt his head roun' en was lookin' at Sally ez ha'd ez he could, en stretchin' his neck en raisin' his years, en whinin' kinder sof' ter hisse'f. "'Yas, honey,' 'lows Dan, 'en you gwine ter feel fus' rate long ez you sticks ter me, fer I's a better man dan dat low down runaway nigger Primus dat you be'n wastin' yo' time wid.' Dan had let go de plow hander, en had put his arm roun' Sally, en was des gwine ter kiss her, w'en sump'n ketch 'im by de scruff er de neck en flung 'im way ober in de cotton patch. W'en he pick' hisse'f up, Sally had gone kittin' down de turn row, en de mule was standin' dere lookin' ez ca'm en peaceful ez a sunny mawnin'. Fus' Dan had 'lowed it was de oberseer w'at had kotch 'im wastin' his time, but dey wa'n't no oberseer in sight, so he 'cluded it must 'a' be'n de mule. So he pitched into de mule en lammed 'im ez hard ez he could. De mule tuk it all, en 'peared ter be ez humble ez a mule could be. But w'en dey was makin' de turn at de een er de row, one er de plow lines got under de mule's hind leg. Dan retched down ter git de line out, sorter careless like, w'en de mule haul off en kick 'im clean ober de fence into a brier patch on de udder side. Dan was mighty so' fum his wounds en scratches, en was laid up fer 2 er 3 days. One night de new mule got out in de pasture en went down to de quarters. Dan was layin' dere on his pallet w'en he heard somethin' bangin' away at de side er his cabin. He raise' up on one shoulder en look roun', w'en w'at should he see but de new mule's head stickin' in de winder, wid his lips drawed back over his toofs, grinnin' en snappin' at Dan des like he wanter eat 'im up. Den de mule went roun' ter de do' en kicked away like he wanter break de do' down, till bimeby somebody come 'long en drive 'im back ter de pasture. W'en Sally come in a little later fum de big house, whar she'd be'n waitin' on de w'ite folks, she foun' po' Dan nigh 'bout dead, he was so skeered. She 'lowed Dan had had de nightmare, but w'en dey look at de do', dey seed de marks er de mule's huffs, so dey couldn't be no mistake 'bout w'at had happen'. Co'se de niggers tole dey marster 'bout de mule's gwines on. Fus' he didn' pay no 'tention to it, but atter a w'ile he tole 'em ef dey didn' stop dey foolishness, he gwine tie some of 'em up. So atter dat, dey didn' say nuffin mo' ter dey marster, but dey kep' on noticin' de mule's queer ways des de same. 'Long 'bout de middle er de summer, dey wuz a big camp meetin' broke out down on de Wim'l'ton Road, en nigh 'bout all de po' w'ite folks en free niggers in de settlement got 'ligion. En lo en behold, 'mongst 'em wuz de Conjure man w'at owned de shote w'at charm Primus. Dis Conjure man wuz a Guinea nigger, en befo' he wuz sot free, had useter belong to a gentleman down in Sampson County. De Conjure man say his daddy wuz a king, a governor, er some sort er whatchamacallem, way ober yonder in Africa, where de niggers come fum, befo' he wuz stowed away en sole ter de speculators. De Conjure man had helped his marster out in some trouble er nudder wid his goopher, en his marster had sot 'im free en bought 'im a trac er lan' down on de Wim'l'ton Road. He purten' ter be a cow doctor, but eve'ybody knowed w'at he r'ally wuz. De Conjure man hadn' mo'd en come th'oo good befo' he wuz took sick wid a cold w'at he cotch kneelin' on de groun' so long at de mo'ners bench. He kep' gittin' wusser en wusser, en bimeby de rheumatiz tuk holt of 'im en drawed 'em all up, till one day he sont word up ter Mars Jim McGee's plantation, en ax Pete, de nigger w'at tuk keer er de mules, fer ter come down dere dat night en fetch dat mule w'at his marster had bought fum de po' w'ite man durin' de summer. Pete didn' know w'at de Conjure man wuz drivin' at, but he didn' dast ter stay away, en so dat night, When he done eat his bacon and his hoe cake, and drunk his molasses and water, he put a bridle on the mule and rid him down to the conjure man's cabin. When he got to the door, he lit and hitched the mule, and then knocks at the door. He felt mighty jubous about going in, but he was obleeged to do it. He knowed he couldn't help himself. "Pull the string," says a weak voice, and when Pete lifted the latch and went in, the conjure man was laying on the bed, looking pale and weak, like he didn't have much longer for to live. "Is you fotch the mule?" says he. Pete said yes, and the conjure man kept on. "Brer Pete," says he, "I's been a monstrous sinner, man, and I's done a power of wickedness in doing it in my days. But the good Lord has washed my sins away, and I feels now that I's bound for the kingdom. And I feels, too, that I ain't going to get up from this bed no more in this world, and I wants to undo some of the harm I done. And that's the reason, Brer Pete, I sent for you to fetch that mule down here. You 'member that shoat I was up to your plantation quiet about last June?" "Yes," says Brer Pete. "I 'member yo' axin' 'bout a shoat you had lost." "I don't know whether you ever learned it or no," says the conjure man, "but I done knowed your master's primus had took the shoat, and I was bound to get even with him. So one night I cotch him down by the swamp on his way to a candy pullin', and I throwed a goofer mixture on him and turned him to a mule, and got a poor white man to sell the mule, and we divided the money. But I don't want to die till I turn Brer Primus back again." Then the conjure man asked Pete to take down 1 or 2 gourds off in the shelf in the corner, and 1 or 2 bottles with some kind of mixture in 'em, and set 'em on a stool by the bed, and then he asked him to fetch the mule in. When the mule come in the door, he gin a snort, and started for the bed, just like he was going to jump on it. "Hold on there, Brer Primus," the conjure man hollered. "I's monstrous weak, and if you commence on me, you won't never have no chance for to get turned back no more." The mule seed the sense of that, and stood still. Then the conjure man took the gourds and bottles and meant to work the roots and yerbs, and the mule meant to turn back to a man. First his ears, then the rest of his head, then his shoulders and arms. All the time the conjure man kept on working his roots, and Pete and Primus could see he was getting weaker and weaker all the time. "Brer Pete," says he by and by, "gimme a drink of them bitters out in that green bottle on the shelf yonder. I's going fast, and it'll give me strength for to finish this work." Brer Pete look up on the mantelpiece, and he see the bottle in the corner. It was so dark in the cabin he couldn't tell whether it was a green bottle or no. But he hilt the bottle to the conjure man's mouth, and he took a big mouthful. He hadn't more than swallowed it before he meant to holler. "You give me the wrong bottle, Brer Pete. This here bottle's got pizen in it, and I's done for this time, sho. Hold me up for the Lord's sake, till I get through turning Brer Primus back." So Pete held him up, and he kept on working the roots, till he got the goofer all took off in Brer Primus, 'ceptin' 1 foot. He hadn't got this foot more than half turned back before his strength gun out entirely, and he dropped the roots and fell back on the bed. "I can't do no more for you, Brer Primus," says he, "but I hopes you will forgive me for what harm I done you. I knows the good Lord done forgive me, and I hope to meet you both in glory. I sees the good angels waiting for me up yonder with a long white robe and a starry crown, and I'm on my way to join 'em." And so the conjure man died, and Pete and Primus went back to the plantation. The darkies all made a great moration when Primus come back. Mars Jim let on like he didn't believe the tale the 2 niggers told. He says Primus had run away, and stayed till he got tired of the swamps, and then come back on 'em to be fed. He tried to account for the shape of Primus's foot by saying Primus got his foot smashed, a snake bit or something, whilst he was away, and then stayed out in the woods where he couldn't get it cured up straight, 'stead of coming 'long home where a doctor could 'a' tended to it.
but de niggers all noticed de marster didn't tie Primus up, ner take on much 'cause de mule was gone. So dey 'lowed dey marster must 'a' had his s'picions 'bout dat cunjuh man." My wife had listened to Julius's recital with only a mild interest. When the old man had finished it, she remarked, "That story does not appeal to me, Uncle Julius, and is not up to your usual mark. It isn't pathetic, it has no moral that I can discover, and I can't see why you should tell it. In fact, it seems to me like nonsense." The old man looked puzzled as well as pained. He had not pleased the lady, and he did not seem to understand why. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said reproachfully, "if you don't like dat tale. I can't make out what you means by some of dem words you uses, but I'm tellin' nuffin but de trufe. Co'se I didn't see de cunjuh man turn 'im back, fer I wa'n't dere, but I be'n hearin' de tale fer 25 years, en I ain' got no 'casion fer ter 'spute it. Dey's so many things a body knows is lies, dat dey ain' no use gwine roun' findin' fault wid tales dat mought des ez well be so ez not. Fer instance, dey's a young nigger gwine ter school in town, en he come out here de yuther day en 'lowed dat de sun stood still en de earth turnt roun' eve'y day on a kinder axle-tree. I tole dat young nigger ef he didn't take hisse'f away wid dem lies, I'd take a buggy trace ter 'im. Fer I sees de earth standin' still all de time, en I sees de sun gwine roun' it, en ef a man can't believe w'at he sees, I can't see no use in livin'. Might's well die en be whar we can't see nuffin. En another thing w'at proves de tale 'bout dis ole Primus is de way he goes on ef anybody ax 'im how he come by dat club foot. I axed 'im one day, mighty polite en civil, en he called me a ole fool en got so mad he ain' spoke ter me sence. It's monst'us queer. But dis is a queer world, any way you could fix it," concluded the old man with a weary sigh. "If you makes up yo' min' not ter buy dat mule, suh," he added as he rose to go, "I knows a man w'at's got a good hoss he wants ter sell. Leastways, dat's w'at I heared. I'm gwine ter prayer meetin' ter night, en I'm gwine right by de man's house, en ef you'd like ter take a look at de hoss, I'll ax 'im ter fetch 'im roun'." "Oh, yes," I said, "you can ask him to stop in if he is passing. There will be no harm in looking at the horse, though I rather think I shall buy a mule." Early next morning the man brought the horse up to the vineyard. At that time I was not a very good judge of horse flesh. The horse appeared sound and gentle, and, as the owner assured me, had no bad habits. The man wanted a large price for the horse, but finally agreed to accept a much smaller sum, upon payment of which I became possessed of a very fine looking animal. But alas for the deceitfulness of appearances! I soon ascertained that the horse was blind in one eye, and that the sight of the other was very defective, and not a month elapsed before my purchase developed most of the diseases that horseflesh is heir to, and a more worthless, broken-winded, spavined quadruped never disgraced the noble name of horse. After worrying through 2 or 3 months of life, he expired one night in a fit of the colic. I replaced him with a mule, and Julius henceforth had to take his chances of driving some metamorphosed unfortunate. Circumstances that afterwards came to my knowledge created in my mind a strong suspicion that Julius may have played a more than unconscious part in this transaction. Among other significant facts was his appearance, the Sunday following the purchase of the horse, in a new suit of store clothes, which I had seen displayed in the window of Mr. Solomon Cohen's store on my last visit to town, and had remarked on account of their striking originality of cut and pattern. As I had not recently paid Julius any money, and as he had no property to mortgage, I was driven to conjecture to account for his possession of the means to buy the clothes. Of course I would not charge him with duplicity unless I could prove it, at least to a moral certainty, but for a long time afterwards I took his advice only in small doses and with great discrimination. End of The Conjurer's Revenge. Section 5 of The Conjure Woman. Sis Becky's Pickaninny.
We had not lived in North Carolina very long before I was able to note a marked improvement in my wife's health. The ozone laden air of the surrounding piney woods, the mild and equable climate, the peaceful leisure of country life, had brought about in hopeful measure the cure we had anticipated. Toward the end of our second year, however, her ailment took an unexpected turn for the worse. She became the victim of a settled melancholy, attended with vague forebodings of impending misfortune. "You must keep up her spirits," said our physician, the best in the neighboring town. "This melancholy lowers her tone too much, tends to lessen her strength, and, if it continue too long, may be fraught with grave consequences." I tried various expedients to cheer her up. I read novels to her. I had the hands on the place come up in the evening and serenade her with plantation songs. Friends came in sometimes and talked, and frequent letters from the North kept her in touch with her former home. But nothing seemed to rouse her from the depression into which she had fallen. One pleasant afternoon in spring, I placed an armchair in a shaded portion of the front piazza, and, filling it with pillows, led my wife out of the house and seated her where she would have the pleasantest view of a somewhat monotonous scenery. She was scarcely placed when old Julius came through the yard, and, taking off his tattered straw hat, inquired somewhat anxiously, "How is you feelin' dis atternoon, ma'am?" "She is not very cheerful, Julius," I said. My wife was apparently without energy enough to speak for herself. The old man did not seem inclined to go away, so I asked him to sit down. I had noticed, as he came up, that he held some small object in his hand. When he had taken his seat on the top step, he kept fingering this object. What it was I could not quite make out. "What is that you have there, Julius?" I asked with mild curiosity. "Dis is my rabbit foot, suh." This was at a time before this curious superstition had attained its present jocular popularity among white people, and, while I had heard of it before, it had not yet outgrown the charm of novelty. "What do you do with it?" "I kyars it wid me for luck, suh." "Julius," I observed half to him and half to my wife, "your people will never rise in the world until they throw off these childish superstitions and learn to live by the light of reason and common sense. How absurd to imagine that the forefoot of a poor dead rabbit, with which he timorously felt his way along through a life surrounded by snares and pitfalls, beset by enemies on every hand, can promote happiness or success, or ward off failure or misfortune." "It is ridiculous," assented my wife with faint interest. "Dat's w'at I tells dese niggers roun' here," said Julius. "De foot ain' got no power. It has ter be de hind foot, suh. De lef hind foot er a grabeyard rabbit kilt by a cross-eyed nigger on a dark night in de full er de moon." "They must be very rare and valuable," I said. "Dey is kinder sca'ce, suh, en dey ain' no 'mount er money could buy mine, suh. I might len' it ter anybody I saw stop by, but I wouldn' sell it. No, indeed, suh, I wouldn'." "How do you know it brings good luck?" I asked. "'Ca'se I ain' had no bad luck sence I had it, suh, en I's had dis rabbit foot fer 40 years. I had a good marster befo' de wah, en I wa'n't sol' away, en I wuz sot free, en dat is all good luck." "But that doesn't prove anything," I rejoined. "Many other people have gone through a similar experience, and probably more than one of them had no rabbit's foot." "Law, suh, you doan have ter prove 'bout de rabbit foot. Eve'ybody knows dat. Leas'ways, eve'ybody roun' here knows it. But ef it has ter be proved ter folks w'at wa'n't born en raise' in dis neighborhood, dey is a easy way ter prove it. Is I ever tole you de tale er Sis' Becky en her pickaninny?" "No," I said. "Let us hear it." I thought perhaps the story might interest my wife as much or more than the novel I had meant to read from. "Dis yer Becky, Julius began, "used to belong to old Colonel Penneton, who owned a plantation down on the Wimbledon Road, 'bout 10 miles from here, just before you gits to Black Swamp. This yer Becky was a field hand, and a monstrous good 'un. She had a husband oncet, a nigger w'at belonged to the next plantation. But the man w'at owned her husband died, and his land and his niggers had to be sold fer to pay his debts. Colonel Penneton 'lowed he'd 'a' bought dis nigger, but he had been bettin' on hoss races, and didn't have no money, and so Becky's husband was sole away to Virginny. Co'se Becky went on some 'bout losin' a man, but she couldn't help herself, and 'sides dat, she had a pickaninny fer to comfort her. Dis yer little Mose was de cutest, blackest, shiny-eyedest little nigger you eber laid eyes on, and he was as fond er his mammy as his mammy was er him. Co'se Becky had to work, and didn't have much time to waste wid her baby. Ole Aun Nancy, de plantation nurse down at de quarters, used to take care of little Mose in de daytime, and atter de niggers come in from de cotton field, Becky 'ud git her chile and kiss him and nuss him and keep him till mornin', and on Sundays she'd have him in de cabin wid her all day long. Sis Becky had got sorter used to gittin' 'long widout her husband, when one day Colonel Penneton went to de races. Co'se, when he went to de races, he took his hosses, and co'se he bet on his own hosses, and co'se he los' his money, fer Colonel Penneton didn't neber have no luck wid his hosses, ef he did keep hisse'f po' projeckin' wid 'em. But dis time dere was a hoss named Lightnin' Bug, w'at belonged to anudder man, en dis hoss won de sweepstakes, en Colonel Penneton tuk a likin' ter dat hoss, en ax' his owner w'at he was willin' ter take fer 'im. 'I'll take $1,000 fer dat hoss,' says dis yer man, who had a big plantation down to'ds Wimbledon, where he raised hosses fer to race en to sell. Well, Colonel Penneton scratch his head en wonder where he was gwine ter raise $1,000, en he didn't see des how he could do it, fer he owed as much as he could borrow already on de sciotity he could gib. But he was des bound ter hab dat hoss, so says he, 'I'll gib you my note fer $1,100 fer dat hoss.' De other man shook his head, and says he, 'Yo' note, suh, is better'n gold, I don't doubt, but I has made it a rule in my business not to take no notes from nobody. Howsomeber, suh, ef you is kinder short of funds, mos' likely we kin make some kinder bargain. En w'iles we is talkin', I might's well say dat I needs anudder good nigger down on my place. Ef you is got a good one ter spare, I might trade wid you.' Now, Colonel Penneton didn't really have no niggers fer ter spare, but he 'lowed to hisse'f he was des bleedzd ter hab dat hoss, en so he says he, 'Well, I don't lack ter, but I reckon I'll hafter. You come out ter my plantation termorrer en look ober my niggers, en pick out de one you wants.' So, sho' 'nuff, nex' day dis yer man come out ter Colonel Penneton's place, en rid roun' de plantation en glanced at de niggers, and who should he pick out from 'em all but Sis Becky. 'I needs a new nigger woman down to my place,' says he, 'fer to cook en wash en so on, en dat young woman'll des fill de bill. You gimme her, en you kin hab Lightnin' Bug.' Now, Colonel Penneton didn't lack to trade Sis Becky, 'cause she was nigh 'bout de best field hand he had, en 'sides, Mars Colonel didn't keer ter take de mammies 'way fum dey child'n w'iles dey child'n was little. But dis man say he want Becky, or else Colonel Penneton couldn't have de race hoss. 'Well,' says de Colonel, 'you kin hab de woman, but I don't lack ter sen' her away from her baby. W'at'll you gimme fer dat nigger baby?' 'I don't want de baby,' says de other man. 'I ain' got no use fer dat baby.' 'I'll tell you w'at I'll do,' 'lows Colonel Penneton. 'I'll th'ow dat pickaninny in fer good measure.' But de other man shook his head. 'No,' says he, 'I's much obleeged, but I don't raise niggers. I raise hosses, en I don't wanter be botherin' wid no nigger babies. Nemmine de baby. I'll keep dat woman so busy she'll fergit de baby, fer niggers is made ter wuk, en dey ain' got no time fer no such foolishness ez babies.' Colonel Penneton didn't want to hurt Becky's feelin's, fer Colonel Penneton was a kin' hearted man, en neber lacked ter make no trouble fer nobody, en so he tole Becky he was gwine ter sen' her down to Robeson County fer a day er so,
to help out his son-in-law in his work, and being as this other man was going that way, he had asked him to take her along in his buggy. "Can I carry little Mose with me, massa?" asked Sis Becky. No," says the colonel, as if he was studying whether to let her take him or no. "I reckon you better let Aunt Nancy look after your baby for the day or two you'll be gone, and she'll see that he gets enough to eat till you gets back." So Sis Becky hugged and kissed little Mose, and told him to be a good little pickaninny and take care of himself, and not forget his mammy while she was gone. And little Mose put his arms around his mammy and laughed and crowed just like it was monstrous fine fun for his mammy to go away and leave him. Well, this here hoss trader started out with Becky, and by, after they'd gone down the Lumberton road for a few miles or so, this man turned round in a different direction and kept going that way, till by Sister Becky up and asked him if he was going to Robeson County by a new road. "Nah, nigger," says he, "I ain't going to Robeson County at all. I's going to Bladen County, where my plantation is, and where I raises all my hosses." "But how is I going to get to Miss Laura's plantation down in Robeson County?" says Becky, with her heart in her mouth, for she commenced to get skeered all of a sudden. "You ain't going to get there at all," says the man. "You belongs to me now, for I done traded my best race hoss for you, with your old massa. If you's a good gal, I'll treat you right, and if you don't behave yourself, why, what else happens 'll be your own fault." 'Course Sister Becky cried and went on about a pickaninny, but 'course it didn't do no good, and by they got down to this here man's place, and he put Sister Becky to work, and forgot all about her having a pickaninny. Meanwhiles, when evening come, the day Sis Becky was took away, little Mose commenced to get restless, and by, when his mammy didn't come, he started to cry for her. Aunt Nancy fed him and rocked him, and finally he just cried and cried till he cried himself to sleep. The next day he didn't 'pear to be as pert as usual, and when night come he fretted and went on worse than he did the night before. The next day his little eyes commenced to lose dey shine, and he wouldn't eat nuffin, and he commenced to look so peaked that Aunt Nancy took and carried him up to the big house and showed him to her old missus, and her old missus gun her some medicine for him, and 'lowed if he didn't get no better she should fetch him up to the big house again, and dey'd have a doctor and nurse little Mose up there, for Aunt Nancy's old missus 'lowed he was a lackly little nigger and wuth raising. But Aunt Nancy had learnt to like little Mose, and she didn't want to have him took up to the big house. And so when he didn't get no better, she gathered a mess of green peas and took the peas and the baby and went to see old Aunt Peggy, the Conjure woman down by the Wimbledon road. She gun Aunt Peggy the mess of peas and told her about Sis Becky and little Mose. "Dat is a monstrous small mess of peas you was fotch me," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "Yes, I knows," 'lowed Aunt Nancy, "but dis yer's a monstrous small pickaninny." "You'll have to fetch me somethin' mo'," says Aunt Peggy, "for you can't 'spect me to waste my time diggin' roots and workin' conj'ation for nuffin." "All right," says Aunt Nancy, "I'll fetch you somethin' mo' nex' time." "You better," says Aunt Peggy, "or else dere'll be trouble. What dis here little pickaninny needs is to see his mammy. You leave him here dis evenin', and I'll show him his mammy." So when Aunt Nancy had gone away, Aunt Peggy took and worked her roots, and turned little Mose to a hummin' bird, and sot him off for to find his mammy. So little Mose flewed and flewed and flewed away, till by he got to the place where Sis Becky belonged. He seed his mammy workin' roun' the yard, and he could tell from lookin' at her that she was troubled in her mind 'bout somethin', and feelin' kind of po'ly. Sis Becky heared somethin' hummin' roun' and roun' her, sweet and low. First she 'lowed it was a hummin' bird, then she thought it sounded like her little Mose, croonin' on her breas', way back yonder on the old plantation. And she jes' imagined it was her little Mose, and it made her feel better, and she went on 'bout her work pearter'n she'd done sence she'd be'n down there. Little Mose stayed roun' till late in the evenin', and then flewed back as hard as he could to Aunt Peggy. As for Sis Becky, she dreamt all that night that she was holding her pickaninny in her arms, and kissing him and nursing him, just like she used to do back on the old plantation where he was born. And for 3 or 4 days Sis Becky went about her work with more spirit than she'd showed since she'd been down there to this man's plantation. The next day after he come back, Lil Mose was mo' pearter and better than he had been for a long time. But to'rds the end of the week he 'mence' to get restless again and stop eating, and Aunt Nancy carried him down to Aunt Peggy once more, and she turned him to a mockingbird this time, and sont him off to see his mammy again. It didn't take him long for to get there, and when he did, he seed his mammy standing in the kitchen looking back in the direction Lil Mose was coming from, and they was tears in her eyes, and she looked mo' po'ly and peaked than she had when he was down there before. So Lil Mose sot on a tree in the yard and sung and sung and sung, just fitting to split his throat. First, Sis Becky didn't notice him much, but this mockingbird kept staying round the house all day, and by Sis Becky just imagined that mockingbird was her little Mose, crowing and crowing, just like he used to do when his mammy would come home at night from the cotton field. The mockingbird stayed round there most all day, and when Sis Becky went out in the yard one time, this here mockingbird lit on her shoulder and pecked at the piece of bread she was eating, and fluttered his wings so they rub up agin the side of her head. And when he flewed away long late in the evening, just 'fore sundown, Sis Becky felt mo' better 'n she had since she had heard that hummingbird a week or so past. And that night she dreamt 'bout old times again, just like she did before. But dis yer totin' little Mose down to ole Aunt Peggy, and dis yer gettin' things fer to pay the Conjure woman use up a lot of Aunt Nancy's time, and she begun to get kinder tired. 'Sides dat, when Sis Becky had been on the plantation, she had used to help Aunt Nancy wid de young'uns evenin's and Sundays. And Aunt Nancy commenced to miss her monstrous, 'specially sence she got a tech of the rheumatiz herself, and so she allows to ole Aunt Peggy one day, "Aunt Peggy, ain't dey no way you kin fetch Sis Becky back home?" "Huh," says Aunt Peggy, "I don't know 'bout dat. I'll have to work my roots and find out whether I can or no, but it'll take a monstrous heap of work, and I can't waste my time for nuffin. If you'll fetch me somethin' to pay me for my trouble, I reckon we can fix it." So next day Aunt Nancy went down to see Aunt Peggy again. "Aunt Peggy," says she, "I has fotch you my best Sunday head handkercher. Will dat do?" Aunt Peggy look at the head handkercher and run her hand over it, and says she, "Yes, dat'll do fus' rate. I's been workin' my roots sence you been gone, and I 'lows most lackly I kin git Sis Becky back, but it's gwine to take figgerin' and studyin' as well as conjurin'. The fust thing to do will be to stop fetchin' dat pickaninny down here, and not sen' 'im to see his mammy no mo'. Ef he gits too po'ly, you lemme know, and I'll gib you some kind of mixtry fer to make 'im fergit Sis Becky fer a week or so. So less'n you comes fer dat, you needn't to come back to see me no mo' till I sends fer you." So Aunt Peggy sent Aunt Nancy away, and the first thing she done was to call a hornet from her nest under her eaves. "You go up to Colonel Pendleton's stable, Hornet," says she, "and sting the knees of a race hoss named Lightning Bug. Be sure and get the right one." So the hornet flewed up to Colonel Pendleton's stable and stung Lightning Bug round the legs, and the next mornin' Lightning Bug's knees was all swole up, twicet as big as they oughter be. When Colonel Pendleton went out to the stable and see the hoss's legs, it would 'a' just made you tremble like a leaf fer to hear him cuss dat hoss trader. Howsomeber, he cool off by and tole the stable boy fer to rub Lightning Bug's legs with some liniment. The boy done as his master tole him, and by the next day the swellin' had gone down considerable. Aunt Peggy had sont a sparrer what had a nest in one of the trees close to her cabin fer to watch w'at was gwine on roun' the big house, and when this here sparrer tole her the hoss was gittin' ober the swellin', she sont the hornet back fer to sting his knees some mo', and the next mornin' Lightning Bug's legs was swole up wuss'n than befo'. Well, dis time Colonel Pendleton was mad thoo and thoo, and all the way roun', and he cussed dat hoss trader up and down, from A to Izzard. He cussed so hard dat the stable boy got most scared to death, and went off and hid hisself in the hay. As for Colonel Pendleton, he went right up to the house and got out his pen and ink and took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves and writ a letter to this here hoss trader, and says he, 'You has sold me a hoss what has got a ring bone or a spavin or something, and what I paid you for was a sound hoss. I want you to send my nigger woman back and take your old hoss, or else I'll sue you shows you born.' But this here man wasn't scared a bit, and he writ back to Colonel Pendleton that a bargain was a bargain, that Lightning Bug was sound when he sold him, and if Colonel Pendleton didn't know enough about hosses to take care of a fine racer, that was his own funeral. And they say Colonel Pendleton can sue and be cussed for all he care, but he ain't going to give up the nigger he bought and paid for." When Colonel Pendleton got this letter, he was mad'n he was before, especially 'cause the man 'lowed he didn't know how to take care of fine horses. But he couldn't do nothing but fetch a lawsuit, and he knowed by his own experience that lawsuits was slow as a 7-year itch and cost more than they come to, and he 'lowed he better go slow and wait a while. Aunt Peggy knowed what was going on all this time, and she fixed up a little bag with some roots and one thing or another in it, and gun it to this sparrer of hern, and told him to take it way down yonder where Sis Becky was, and drap it right before the door of her cabin, so she'd be sure and find it the first time she come out in the door. One night Sis Becky dreamt her pickaninny was dead, and the next day she was moaning and groaning all day. She dreamt the same dream 3 nights running, and then, the next morning after the last night, she found this here little bag the sparrow had dropped in front of her door, and she 'lowed she'd been conjured and was going to die, and as long as her pickaninny was dead, they wa'n't no use trying to do nothing nohow. And so she took and went to bed and told her marster she'd been conjured and was going to die. Her marster laughed at her and argued with her and tried to sway her out of this here fool notion, as he called it, for he was one of these here white folks would pretend they don't believe in conjuring, but it wasn't no use. Sis Becky kept getting worser and worser, till finally this here man 'lowed Sis Becky was going to die sure 'nuff. And as he knowed they hadn't been nothing the matter with Lightning Bug when he traded him, he 'lowed maybe he could cure him and fetch him round all right, leastways good enough to sell again. And anyhow, a lame hoss was better than a dead nigger. So he sat down and writ Colonel Pendleton a letter. "My conscience," says he, "has been troubling me 'bout that ring-bone hoss I sold you. Some folks 'lows a hoss trader ain't got no conscience, but they don't know me, for that is my weak spot, and the reason I ain't made no more money hoss trading. Fac' is," says he, "I's got so I can't sleep nights from studyin' 'bout dat spavin hoss, and I's made up my mind dat whiles a bargain is a bargain, and you seed Lightning Bug before you traded for him, principle is worth mo' den money, or hosses, or niggers. So if you'll send Lightning Bug down here, I'll send your nigger woman back, and we'll call the trade off and be as good friends as we ever was, and no hard feelings." So, sure enough, Colonel Pendleton sont the hoss back, and when the man what come to bring Lightning Bug told Sis Becky her pickaninny wasn't dead, Sis Becky was so glad that she 'lowed she was going to try to live till she got back where she could see little Mose once more. And when she reached the old plantation and seed her baby kicking and crowing and holding out his little arms towards her, she wished she wasn't conjured and didn't have to die. And when Aunt Nancy told her all about Aunt Peggy, Sis Becky went down to see the conjure woman, and Aunt Peggy told her she had conjured her. And then Aunt Peggy took the goopher off'n her, and she got well, and stayed on the plantation and raised her pickaninny. And when little Mose growed up, he could sing and whistle just like a mockingbird, so that the white folks used to have him come up to the big house at night and whistle and sing for him, and they used to give him money and vittles and one thing or another, which he allers took home to his mammy, for he knowed all about what she had gone through. He turned out to be a smart man, and learnt the blacksmith trade, and Colonel Pendleton let him high his time. And by he bought his mammy and sot her free, and then he bought hisself and took care of Sis Becky as long as they both lived. My wife had listened to this story with greater interest than she had manifested in any subject for several days.
I had watched her furtively from time to time during the recital, and had observed the play of her countenance. It had expressed in turn sympathy, indignation, pity, and, at the end, lively satisfaction. "That is a very ingenious fairy tale, Julius," I said, "and we are much obliged to you." "Why, John," said my wife severely, "the story bears the stamp of truth, if ever a story did." "Yes," I replied, "especially the humming bird episode, and the mocking bird digression, to say nothing of the doings of the hornet and the sparrow." "Oh, well, I don't care," she rejoined with delightful animation. "Those are mere ornamental details, and not at all essential. The story is true to nature, and might have happened half a hundred times, and no doubt did happen, in those horrid days before the war." "By the way, Julius," I remarked, "your story doesn't establish what you started out to prove, that a rabbit's foot brings good luck." "It's plain 'nuff ter me, suh," replied Julius. "I bet young missis dere kin 'splain it herse'f." "I rather suspect," replied my wife promptly, "that Sis' Becky had no rabbit's foot." "You is hit de bull's eye de fus' fire, ma'am," assented Julius. "Ef Sis' Becky had had a rabbit foot, she neber would 'a' went th'ough all dis trouble." I went into the house for some purpose, and left Julius talking to my wife. When I came back a moment later he was gone. My wife's condition took a turn for the better from this very day, and she was soon on the way to ultimate recovery. Several weeks later, after she had resumed her afternoon drives, which had been interrupted by her illness, Julius brought the rockaway round to the front door one day, and I assisted my wife into the carriage. "John," she said before I had taken my seat, "I wish you would look in my room and bring me my handkerchief. You will find it in the pocket of my blue dress." I went to execute the commission. When I pulled the handkerchief out of her pocket, something else came with it and fell on the floor. I picked up the object and looked at it. It was Julius's rabbit's foot. End of Sis' Becky's Pickaninny. Section 6 of the Conjure Woman. The Gray Wolf's Haunt. It was a rainy day at the vineyard. The morning had dawned bright and clear. But the sky had soon clouded, and by 9 o'clock there was a light shower, followed by others at brief intervals. By noon the rain had settled into a dull, steady downpour. The clouds hung low, and seemed to grow denser instead of lighter as they discharged their watery burden, and there was now and then a muttering of distant thunder. Outdoor work was suspended, and I spent most of the day at the house, looking over my accounts and bringing up some arrears of correspondence. Towards 4 o'clock I went out on the piazza, which was broad and dry, and less gloomy than the interior of the house, and composed myself for a quiet smoke. I had lit my cigar and opened the volume I was reading at that time, when my wife, whom I had left dozing on a lounge, came out and took a rocking chair near me. "I wish you would talk to me, or read to me, or something," she exclaimed petulantly. "It's awfully dull here to day." "I'll read to you with pleasure," I replied, and began at the point where I had found my bookmark. The difficulty of dealing with transformations so many-sided as those which all existences have undergone, or are undergoing, is such as to make a complete and deductive interpretation almost hopeless. So to grasp the total process of redistribution of matter and motion, as to see simultaneously its several necessary results in their actual interdependence, is scarcely possible. There is, however, a mode of rendering the process as a whole tolerably comprehensible. Though the genesis of the rearrangement of every evolving aggregate is in itself one, it presents to our intelligence— "John," interrupted my wife, "I wish you would stop reading that nonsense and see who that is coming up the lane." I closed my book with a sigh.
I had never been able to interest my wife in the study of philosophy, even when presented in the simplest and most lucid form. Some one was coming up the lane, at least a huge faded cotton umbrella was making progress toward the house, and beneath it a pair of nether extremities in trousers was discernible. Any doubt in my mind as to whose they were was soon resolved when Julius reached the steps, and, putting the umbrella down, got a good dash of the rain as he stepped up on the porch. "Why in the world, Julius," I asked, "didn't you keep the umbrella up until you got under cover?" "It's bad luck, suh, to raise a umbrella in the house, and w'iles I don't know whether it's bad luck to carry one into the piazza or no, I 'lows it's alluz best to be on the safe side. I didn't s'pose you en young missis 'ud be gwine on yo' dribe ter day, but bein' ez it's my part ter take you ef you does, I 'lowed I'd report fer duty, en let you say whether or no you wants ter go." "I'm glad you came, Julius," I responded. "We don't want to go driving, of course, in the rain, but I should like to consult you about another matter. I'm thinking of taking in a piece of new ground. What do you imagine it would cost to have that neck of woods down by the swamp cleared up?" The old man's countenance assumed an expression of unwonted seriousness, and he shook his head doubtfully. "I don't know 'bout dat, suh. It mought cost mo', en it mought cost less, ez fur ez money is consarned. I ain' denyin' you could cl'ar up dat trac' of lan' fer $100 er a couple of $100, ef you wants ter cl'ar it up. But ef dat 'uz my trac' of lan', I wouldn't disturb it, no suh, I wouldn't. Sho's you bawn I wouldn't." "But why not?" I asked. "It ain't fittin' fer grapes, fer new ground nebber is." "I know it, but" "It ain't no yearthly good fer cotton, 'cause it's too low." "Perhaps, but it will raise splendid corn." "I don't know," rejoined Julius deprecatorially. "It's so near de swamp dat de coons'll eat up all de corn." "I think I'll risk it," I answered. "Well, suh," said Julius, "I wishes you much joy of yo' job. Ef you has bad luck, er sickness, er trouble er any kin', don't blame me. You can't say ole Julius didn't warn you." "Warn him of what, Uncle Julius?" asked my wife. "Er de bad luck w'at follers folks w'at 'sturbs dat trac' of lan'. Dey is snakes en scorpions in dem woods, en ef you manages ter 'scape de p'ison animals, you is des boun' ter hab a haunt ter settle wid, ef you don't hab two." "Whose haunt?" my wife demanded with growing interest. "De gray wolf's haunt, some folks calls it, but I knows better." "Tell us about it, Uncle Julius," said my wife. "A story will be a godsend to day." It was not difficult to induce the old man to tell a story, if he were in a reminiscent mood. Of tales of the old slavery days he seemed indeed to possess an exhaustless store, some weirdly grotesque, some broadly humorous, some bearing the stamp of truth, faint perhaps, but still discernible, others palpable inventions, whether his own or not we never knew, though his fancy doubtless embellished them. But even the wildest was not without an element of pathos, the tragedy, it might be, of the story itself, the shadow, never absent, of slavery and of ignorance, the sadness always of life as seen by the fading light of an old man's memory. "Way back yonder, befo' de wah," began Julius, "ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo useter own a nigger name' Dan. Dan wuz big en strong en hearty en peaceable en good natured, most er de time, but dangerous ter aggravate. He alluz done his task, en nebber had no trouble wid de w'ite folks, but woe be unto a nigger w'at 'lowed he could fool wid Dan, fer he wuz mos' sho' ter git a good lammin'. Soon ez eve'ybody foun' Dan out, dey didn' many un 'em 'tempt ter 'sturb 'im. De one dat did would 'a wush' he hadn', ef he could 'a' libbed long ernuff ter do any wushin'. It all happen' dis a way. Dey wuz a cunjuh man w'at libbed ober ter de udder side er de Lumberton Road. He had been the only conjure doctor in the neighborhood for long dis many years, till ole Aunt Peggy sot up in de business down by the Wimbledon road. Dis conjure man had a son w'at libbed wid 'im, en it was dis yer son w'at got mix' up wid Dan, en all 'bout a 'oman. Dey wuz a gal on de plantation name' Mahaly. She wuz a monst'us lackly gal, tall en supple, wid big eyes en a small foot, en a lively tongue, en w'en Dan tuk ter gwine wid her, eve'ybody 'lowed dey wuz well match', en none er de other nigger men on de plantation dares ter go near her, fer dey wuz all feared er Dan. Now it happen' dat dis yer cunjuh man's son wuz gwine 'long de road one day, w'en who should come pas' but Mahaly. En de minute dis man sot eye on Mahaly, he 'lowed he wuz gwine ter hab her fer hisse'f. He come up side er her en 'mence' ter talk to her, but she didn' pay no 'tention ter 'im, fer she wuz studyin' 'bout Dan, en she didn' lack dis nigger's looks nohow. So w'en she got ter whar she wuz gwine, dis yer man wa'n't no furder 'long dan he wuz w'en he sta'ted. Co'se, atter he had made up his min' fer ter git Mahaly, he 'mence' ter 'quire roun', en soon foun' out all 'bout Dan, en w'at a dangerous nigger he wuz. But dis man 'lowed his daddy wuz a cunjuh man, en so he come out all right in de een', en he kep' right atter Mahaly. Meanwhiles, Dan's marster had said dey could git ma'ed ef dey want her, en so Dan en Mahaly had tuk up wid one anudder, en wuz libbin' in a cabin by deyse'ves, en wuz des wrop up in one anudder. But dis yer cunjuh man's son didn' 'pear ter min' Dan's takin' up wid Mahaly, en he kep' on hangin' roun' des de same, till fin'ly one day Mahaly says ter Dan, says she, 'I wish you'd do sump'n ter stop dat free nigger man fum followin' me roun'. I don' lack 'im nohow, en I ain' got no time fer ter was'e wid no man but you.' Co'se Dan got mad w'en he heard 'bout dis man pesterin' Mahaly, en de nex' night, w'en he seed dis nigger comin' 'long de road, he up en ax' 'im w'at he mean by hangin' roun' his 'oman. De man didn' 'spon' ter suit Dan, en one word led to anudder, till bimeby dis cunjuh man's son pull out a knife en sta'ted ter stick it in Dan, but befo' he could git it drawed good, Dan haul off en hit 'im in de head so hard dat he neber got up. Dan 'lowed he'd come to atter a w'ile en go 'long 'bout his business, so he went off en lef 'im layin' dere on de groun'. De nex' mawnin' de man was foun' dead. Dey wuz a great 'miration made 'bout it, but Dan didn' say nuffin, en none er de other niggers hadn' seen de fight, so dey wa'n't no way ter tell who done de killin'. En bein' ez it wuz a free nigger, en dey wa'n't no w'ite folks speshly int'rested, dey wa'n't nuffin done 'bout it, en de cunjuh man come en tuk his son en kyar'd 'im away en buried 'im. Now Dan hadn't meant ter kill dis nigger, en w'iles he knowed de man hadn't got no mo' d'n he deserved, Dan 'mence' ter worry mo' er less, fer he knowed dis man's daddy would wuk his roots en prob'ly fin' out who'd kilt his son, en make all de trouble fer 'im he could, en Dan kep' on studyin' 'bout dis till he got so he didn' hardly dast ter eat er drink fer fear dis cunjuh man had poison de vittles er de water. Fin'ly he 'lowed he'd go ter see Aun' Peggy, de new cunjuh 'oman w'at had moved down by de Wimbledon road, en ax her fer ter do sump'n ter protect 'im fum dis cunjuh man. So he tuk a peck er 'taters en went down ter her cabin one night. Aun' Peggy heared his tale, en den says she, 'Dat cunjuh man is mo' d'n twice ez ole ez I is, en he kin make monst'us powerful goopher. W'at you needs is a life cha'm, en I'll make you one termorrer. It's de only thing w'at'll do you any good. You leave me a couple er hairs from yo' head, en fetch me a pig termorrer night fer de roas', en w'en you come, I'll have de cha'm all ready fer you.' So Dan went down to Aun' Peggy de nex' night, wid a young shote, en Aun' Peggy gun 'im de cha'm. She had tuk de hairs Dan had lef wid her in a piece er red flannen, en some roots en yerbs, en had put 'em in a little bag made out er coon skin. 'You take dis cha'm,' says she, 'en put it in a bottle er a tin box, en bury it deep under de root er a live oak tree, en ez long ez it stays dere safe en soun', dey ain' no poison kin poison you, dey ain' no rattlesnake kin bite you, dey ain' no scorpion kin sting you. Dis yer cunjuh man mought do one thing er anudder ter you, but he can't kill you. So you neenter be at all skeered, but go 'long 'bout yo' business en don't bother yo' min'.' So Dan went down by the river, and way up on the bank he buried the charm deep under the root of a live oak tree, and covered it up and stomped the dirt down and scattered leaves over the spot, and then went home with his mind easy. Sure 'nuff, this yer cunjuh man worked his roots, just as Dan had 'spected he would, and soon learned who kilt his son. En co'se he made up his mind fer ter git even wid Dan, so he sot a rattlesnake fer ter sting 'im. But de rattlesnake say de nigger's heels was so hard he couldn't git his sting in. Den he sent his jaybird fer ter put poison in Dan's vittles, but de poison didn't work. Den de cunjuh man 'lowed he'd double Dan all up wid de rheumatiz, so he couldn't git his hand to his mouf ter eat, en would hafter starve ter death. But Dan went to Aun' Peggy, en she got him a ointment ter cure de rheumatiz. Den de cunjuh man 'lowed he'd burn Dan up wid a fever, but Aun' Peggy tol' him how ter make some yerb tea fer dat. Nuffin dis man tried would kill Dan, so finally de cunjuh man 'lowed Dan mus' hab a life charm. Now dis yer jaybird de cunjuh man had was a monst'us smart critter. Fac', de niggers 'lowed he was de ole debbil hisse'f, des settin' roun' waitin' ter kyar dis ole man away w'en he retched de een' er his rope. De cunjuh man sont dis jaybird fer ter watch Dan en fin' out whar he kep' his charm. De jaybird hung roun' Dan fer a week er so, en one day he see Dan go down by de riber en look at a live oak tree. En den de jaybird went back to his marster en tol' 'im he 'spect de nigger kep' his life charm under dat tree. De cunjuh man laughed en laughed, en he put on his biggest pot en fill it wid his strongest roots, en boil it, till bimeby de win' blowed en blowed till it blowed down de live oak tree. Den he stirred some mo' roots in de pot, en it rained en rained till de water run down de river bank en wash Dan's life charm inter de river, en de bottle went bobbin' down de current des as unconsarned ez ef it wa'n't takin' po' Dan's chances all 'long wid it. En den de cunjuh man laugh some mo', en 'lowed ter hisse'f dat he was gwine ter fix Dan now, sho' 'nuff. He wa'n't gwine kill 'im des yet, fer he could do somethin' to 'im w'at would hurt wusser'n killin'. So dis cunjuh man commenced ter gwine up ter Dan's cabin eve'y night, en takin' Dan out in his sleep, en ridin' him roun' de roads en fields over de rough groun'. In de mawnin' Dan would be as tired ez ef he hadn't be'n ter sleep. Dis kinder thing kep' up fer a week er so, en Dan had des 'bout made up his min' fer ter go en see Aun' Peggy ag'in, w'en who should he come across, gwine 'long de road one day to'ds sundown, but dis yer cunjuh man. Dan felt kinder skeered at fus', but den he 'membered 'bout his life charm, w'ich he hadn't be'n ter see fer a week er so, en 'lowed was safe en soun' under de live oak tree. En so he helt up his head en walk' 'long des lack he didn't keer nuffin 'bout dis man no mo'n any yuther nigger. W'en he got close ter de cunjuh man, dis cunjuh man sez he, "Howdy, Brer Dan, I hope you er well." W'en Dan seed de cunjuh man was in a good humor en didn't 'pear ter bear no malice, Dan 'lowed maybe de cunjuh man hadn't foun' out who kilt his son, en so he 'termine' fer ter let on lack he didn't know nuffin, en so sez he, "Howdy, Uncle Jube." Dis ole cunjuh man's name was Jube. "I's putty well, thank you. How is you feelin' dis mawnin'?" "I's feelin' ez well ez ole nigger could feel w'at had los' his only son en his main dependence in his ole age. But den my son wuz a bad boy," sez he, "en I couldn't 'spec nuffin e'se. I tried ter l'arn 'im de error er his ways en make 'im go ter chu'ch en prayer meetin', but it wa'n't no use. I don't know who kilt 'im, en I don't wanter know, fer I'd be mos' sure ter find out dat my boy had started de fuss. Ef I'd had a son like you, Brer Dan, I'd 'a' be'n a proud nigger. Oh, yes, I would, sho's you bawn. But you ain't lookin' ez well ez you oughter, Brer Dan. Dey's somethin' de matter wid you, en w'at's mo', I 'spec you don't know w'at it is." Now dis yer kinder talk natchully th'owed Dan off'n his guard, en fus' thing he knowed he was talkin' ter dis ole cunjuh man des lack he was one er his bes' frien's. He tol' 'im all 'bout not feelin' well in de mawnin', en ax' 'im ef he could tell w'at wuz de matter wid 'im. "Yas," sez de cunjuh man, Dey is a witch been riding you right along. I can see the marks of the bridle on your mouth. And I'll just bet your back is raw where she been beating you." "Yes," responded Dan, "so it is." He hadn't noticed it before, but now he felt just like the hide had been took off'n him. "And yo' thighs is just raw where the spurs has been driving in you," says the Conjure man. "You can't see the raw spots, but you can feel 'em." "Oh, yes," 'lows Dan, "dey does hurt powerful bad." "And what's mo'," says the Conjure man, comin' up close to Dan and whisperin' in his ear, "I knows who it is been riding you." "Who is it?" asks Dan. "Tell me who it is." "It's a ole nigger woman down by Rockfish Crick. She had a pet rabbit, and you cotch 'im one day, and she's been squarin' up wid you ever sence. But you better stop her, er else she'll be rid to death in a month er so." "No," says Dan, "she can't kill me, sho'." "I don't know how dat is," said the Conjure man, "but she kin make yo' life mighty mis'able. Ef I was in yo' place, I'd stop her right off." "But how is I gwine ter stop her?" ax Dan. "I don't know nuffin 'bout stoppin' witches." "Look here, Dan," says the other, "you is a good young man. I likes you monst'us well. Fac', I feels like some er dese days I mought buy you from yo' marster, ef I could eber make money enough at my business dese hard times, en 'dopt you fer my son. I likes you so well dat I'm gwine ter help you git rid er dis yer witch fer good en all. Fer des ez long ez she libs, you is sho' ter have trouble en mo' trouble." "You is de bes' frien' I got, Uncle Jube," says Dan, "en I'll 'member yo' kindness ter my dyin' day. Tell me how I kin git rid er dis yer ole witch w'at's been ridin' me so hard." "In de fus' place," says the Conjure man, "dis ole witch neber comes in her own shape, but eve'y night at 10 o'clock she turns herse'f into a black cat, en runs down ter yo' cabin en bridles you, en mounts you, en dribes you out th'oo de chimbly, en rides you ober de roughest places she kin fin'. All you gotter do is ter set fer her in de bushes side yo' cabin, en hit her in de head wid a rock or a lighted knot w'en she goes pas'." "But," says Dan, "how kin I see her in de dark? En s'posen I hits her en misses her, er s'posen I des wounds her en she gits away, w'at she gwine do ter me den?" "I's done studied 'bout all dem things," says the Conjure man, "en it 'pears ter me de bes' plan fer you ter foller is ter lemme turn you ter some creetur w'at kin see in de dark, en w'at kin run des ez fas' ez a cat, en w'at kin bite, en bite fer ter kill. En den you won't hafter have no trouble atter de job is done. I don't know whether you like dat er not, but dat is de sho'est way." "I don't keer," 'spon' Dan. "I'd des ez lief be anything fer a hour er so, ef I kin kill dat ole witch. You kin do des w'at you er min' ter." "All right, den," says the Conjure man. "You come down ter my cabin at half pas' 9 o'clock ter night, en I'll fix you up." Now dis Conjure man, w'en he had got th'oo talkin' wid Dan, kep' on down de road 'long de side er de plantation, 'tel he met Mahaly comin' home fum wuk des atter sundown. "How de do, ma'am?" says he. "Is yo' name Sister Mahaly, w'at b'longs ter Mars Dugal' McAdoo?" "Yes," respon' Mahaly, "dat's my name, en I b'longs ter Mars Dugal'." "Well," says he, "yo' husban' Dan wuz down by my cabin dis ebenin', en he got bit by a spider er somethin', en his foot is swole up so he can't walk, en he ax me fer ter fin' you en fetch you down dere ter he'p 'im home. Co'se Mahaly wanter see w'at had happen' ter Dan, en so she sta'ted down de road wid de Conjure man. Ez soon ez he got her inter his cabin, he shet de do' en sprinkle some goopher mixtry on her, en turnt her ter a black cat. Den he tuk en put her in a barrel, en put a bo'd on de barrel, en a rock on de bo'd, en lef her dere 'tel he got good en ready fer ter use her. 'Long 'bout half pas' 9 o'clock, Dan come down ter de Conjure man's cabin. It was a warm night, en de do' was stannin' open. De Conjure man 'vised Dan ter come in en pass de time er day wid 'im. Ez soon ez Dan commenced talkin', he heared a cat meowin' en scratchin' en gwine on at a turrible rate. "What's all that fuss about?" asked Dan. "Oh, dat ain't nuffin but my ole gray tomcat," says de cunjuh man. "I has ter shut 'im up sometimes fer ter keep 'im in nights, en co'se he don't lack it." "Now," 'lows de cunjuh man, "lemme tell you des w'at you is got ter do. W'en you ketches dis witch, you mus' take her right by de throat en bite her right th'ough de neck. Be sho' yo' teef goes th'ough at de fus bite, en den you won't never be bothered no mo' by dat witch. En w'en you git done, come back here en I'll turn you to yo'self ag'in, so you kin go home en git yo' night's res'." Den de cunjuh man gun Dan somethin' nice en sweet ter drink out'n a new gourd, en in 'bout a minute Dan foun' hisse'f turnt to a gray wolf, en soon ez he felt all four his new feet on de groun', he sta'ted off fas' ez he could fer his own cabin, so he could be sho' en be dere time enough ter ketch de witch en put a een' ter her carryin's on. Ez soon ez Dan wuz gone good, de cunjuh man tuk de rock off'n de board en de board off'n de barrel, en out let Mahaly en sta'ted fer ter go home, des like a cat er a 'oman er anybody else would w'at wuz in trouble. En it wa'n't many minutes befo' she wuz gone up de path ter her own do'. Meanwhiles, w'en Dan had retched de cabin, he had hid hisse'f in a bunch er jimson weeds in de yard. He hadn't waited long befo' he seed a black cat run up de path to'ds de do'. Des ez soon ez she got close ter him, he leapt out en ketch her by de throat, en got a grip on her des like de cunjuh man had tole him ter do. En lo en behold, no sooner had de blood commenced ter flow den de black cat tu'nt back ter Mahaly, en Dan seed dat he had kilt his own wife. En w'iles her breff wuz gone, she call out, "Oh, Dan! Oh, my husban'! Come en help me! Come en save me fum dis wolf w'at's killin' me!" W'en po' Dan sta'ted to'ds her, ez any man nat'ally would, it des made her holler wuss en wuss, fer she didn' know dis yer wolf wuz her Dan. En Dan des had ter hide in de weeds en grit his teef en hol' hisse'f in till she passed out in her misery, callin' fer Dan ter de las', en wonderin' why he didn' come en help her. En Dan 'lowed ter hisse'f he'd ruther 'd be'n kilt a dozen times dan ter done w'at he had ter Mahaly. Dan wuz mighty nigh 'stracted, but w'en Mahaly wuz dead en he got his min' straighten' out a little, it didn' take 'im mo' d'n a minute er so fer ter see th'ough all de cunjuh man's lies, en how de cunjuh man had fooled 'im en made 'im kill Mahaly fer ter git eben wid 'im fer killin' er his son. He kep' gittin' madder en madder, en Mahaly hadn' much mo' d'n drawed her las' breff befo' he sta'ted back ter de cunjuh man's cabin hard ez he could run. W'en he got dere, de do' wuz standin' open, a lighted knot wuz flickin' on de hearth, en de ole cunjuh man wuz settin' dere noddin' in de corner. Dan leapt in de do' en jump fer dis man's throat, en got de same grip on him w'at de cunjuh man had tole him 'bout half hour befo'. It wuz hard work dis time, fer de ole man's neck wuz monst'us tough en stringy, but Dan hilt on long enough ter be sho' his job wuz done right. En eben den he didn' hol' on long enough, fer w'en he turnt de cunjuh man loose en he fell ober on de flo', de cunjuh man rolt his eyes at Dan, en sezee, "I's eben wid you, Brer Dan, en you er eben wid me. You kilt my son, en I kilt yo' 'oman, en ez I don't want no mo' d'n w'at's fair 'bout dis thing, ef you'll retch up wid yo' paw en take down dat gourd hangin' on dat peg ober de chimbley, en take a sip er dat mixtry, it'll turn you back to a nigger ag'in, en I kin die mo' satisfied 'n ef I lef you like you is." Dan nebber 'lowed fer a minute dat a man would lie wid his las' breff, en co'se he seed de sense er gittin' tu'nt back befo' de cunjuh man died, so he clumb on a chair en retch fer de gourd en tuk a sip er de mixtry. En ez soon ez he done dat, de cunjuh man laugh his las' laugh en gasped out wid his las' gaps. "Uh-huh, I reckon I's square wid you now fer killin' me too, fer dat goopher on you is done fix en sot now fer good, en all de cunjuh in de worl' won't nebber take it off. Wolf you is en wolf you stays, all de res' er yo' bawn days." Co'se Brer Dan couldn't do nuffin. He knowed it wa'n't no use, but he clummed up on de chimbley en got down de gourds en bottles en other cunjuh fixin's, en tried 'em all on hisse'f, but dey didn' do no good. Den dey run down to ole Aunt Peggy, but she didn't know the wolf language, en couldn't 'a' took off dis other goopher nohow, even ef she'd 'a' understood w'at Dan was sayin'. So po' Dan was 'bleeged ter be a wolf all de rest er his bawn days. Dey foun' Mahaly down by her own cabin nex' mawnin', en eve'ybody made a great 'miration 'bout how she'd be'n killt. De niggers 'lowed a wolf had bit her. De w'ite folks say no, dey ain' be'n no wolves roun' dere fer 10 years er mo', en dey didn' know w'at ter make out'n it. En w'en dey couldn't fin' Dan nowhar, dey 'lowed he'd quarreled wid Mahaly en killt her, en run away, en dey didn' know w'at ter make er dat, fer Dan en Mahaly wuz de mos' lovin' couple on de plantation. Dey put de dogs on Dan's scent, en track' 'im down ter ole Uncle Jube's cabin, en foun' de ole man dead, en dey didn' know w'at ter make er dat. En den Dan's scent gun out, en dey didn' know w'at ter make er dat. Mars Dugal' tuk on a heap 'bout losin' two er his bes' han's in one day, en ole missus 'lowed it wuz a jedgment on 'im fer sump'n he'd done. But dat fall de crops wuz monst'us big, so Mars Dugal' say de Lawd had tempered de win' ter de shone ram, en make up ter 'im fer w'at he had los'. Dey buried Mahaly down in dat piece er low groun' you were talkin' 'bout cl'arin' up. Ez fer po' Dan, he didn' have nowhere e'se ter go, so he des stayed roun' Mahaly's grave, w'en he wa'n't out in yonder woods gittin' sump'n ter eat. En sometimes w'en night would come, de niggers useter hear 'im howlin' en howlin' down dere, des fittin' ter break his heat. En den some mo' on 'em said dey seed Mahaly's ha'nt dere 'bun'ance er times, colloguin' wid dis gray wolf. En eben now, 50 years sence, long atter ole Dan is died en dried up in de woods, his ha'nt en Mahaly's hangs roun' dat piece er low groun', en eve'ybody w'at goes 'bout dere has some bad luck er nother, fer ha'nts don't lack ter be disturbed on dey own stompin' groun'." The air had darkened while the old man related this harrowing tale. The rising wind whistled around the eaves, slammed the loose window shutters, and, still increasing, drove the rain in fiercer gusts into the piazza. As Julius finished his story, and we rose to seek shelter within doors, the blast caught the angle of some chimney or gable in the rear of the house, and bore to our ears a long wailing note, an epitome, as it were, of remorse and hopelessness. "Dat's jes' like po' ole Dan useter howl," observed Julius, as he reached for his umbrella. "En w'at I be'n tellin' you is de reason I don't lack ter see dat neck er woods cleared up. 'Cause it belongs ter you, en a man kin do ez he choose wid his own. But ef you gits rheumatiz, er fever en ague, er ef you're a snake bit er poison wid some yerb er n'other, er ef a tree falls on you, er a ha'nt runs you en makes you git 'stracted in yo' min', like some folks I knows w'at went foolin' roun' dat piece er lan', you can't say I neber warned you, suh, en tol' you w'at you might look fer en be sho' ter fin'." When I cleared up the land in question, which was not until the following year, I recalled the story Julius had told us, and looked in vain for a sunken grave, or perhaps a few weather bleached bones of some denizen of the forest. I cannot say, of course, that some one had not been buried there, but if so, the hand of time had long since removed any evidence of the fact. If some lone wolf, the last of his pack, had once made his den there, his bones had long since crumbled into dust and gone to fertilize the rank vegetation that formed the undergrowth of this wild spot. I did find, however, a bee tree in the woods, with an ample cavity in its trunk, and an opening through which convenient access could be had to the stores of honey within. I have reason to believe that ever since I had bought the place, and for many years before, Julius had been getting honey from this tree. The gray wolf's haunt had doubtless proved useful in keeping off too inquisitive people who might have interfered with his monopoly. End of The Gray Wolf's Haunt. Section 7 of The Conjure Woman. Hotfoot Hannibal. I hate you and despise you. I wish never to see you or speak to you again. Very well, I will take care that henceforth you have no opportunity to do either. These words,
the first in the passionately vibrant tones of my sister-in-law, and the latter in the deeper and more restrained accents of an angry man, startled me from my nap. I had been dozing in my hammock on the front piazza, behind the honeysuckle vine. I had been faintly aware of a buzz of conversation in the parlor, but had not at all awakened to its import until these sentences fell, or I might rather say were hurled upon my ear. I presume the young people had either not seen me lying there, the Venetian blinds opening from the parlor windows upon the piazza were partly closed on account of the heat, or else in their excitement they had forgotten my proximity. I felt somewhat concerned. The young man, I had remarked, was proud, firm, jealous of the point of honor, and, from my observation of him, quite likely to resent to the bitter end what he deemed a slight or an injustice. The girl, I knew, was quite as high-spirited as young Murchison. I feared she was not so just, and hoped she would prove more yielding. I knew that her affections were strong and enduring, but that her temperament was capricious and her sunniest moods easily overcast by some small cloud of jealousy or pique. I had never imagined, however, that she was capable of such intensity as was revealed by these few words of hers. As I say, I felt concerned. I had learned to like Malcolm Murchison, and had heartily consented to his marriage with my ward, for it was in that capacity that I had stood for a year or two to my wife's younger sister, Mabel. The match, thus rudely broken off, had promised to be another link binding me to the kindly Southern people among whom I had not long before taken up my residence. Young Murchison came out of the door, cleared the piazza in 2 strides without seeming aware of my presence, and went off down the lane at a furious pace. A few moments later Mabel began playing the piano loudly, with a touch that indicated anger and pride and independence, and a dash of exultation, as though she were really glad that she had driven away forever the young man whom the day before she had loved with all the ardor of a first passion. I hoped that time might heal the breach and bring the 2 young people together again. I told my wife what I had overheard. In return, she gave me Mabel's version of the affair. "I do not see how it can ever be settled," my wife said. "It is something more than a mere lovers' quarrel. It began, it is true, because she found fault with him for going to church with that hateful Branson girl. But before it ended there were things said that no woman of any spirit could stand. I am afraid it is all over between them." I was sorry to hear this. In spite of the very firm attitude taken by my wife and her sister, I still hoped that the quarrel would be made up within a day or 2. Nevertheless, when a week had passed with no word from young Murchison, and with no sign of relenting on Mabel's part, I began to think myself mistaken. One pleasant afternoon, about 10 days after the rupture, old Julius drove the rockaway up to the piazza, and my wife Mabel and I took our seats for a drive to a neighbor's vineyard, over on the Lumberton plank road. "Which way shall we go?" I asked, "the short road or the long one?" "I guess we had better take the short road," answered my wife. "We will get there sooner." "It's a mighty fine drive round by the big road, Miss Annie," observed Julius, "and it don't take much longer to get there." "No," said my wife, "I think we will go by the short road. There is a bay tree in blossom near the mineral spring, and I wish to get some of the flowers." "I 'spects you'd find some bay trees 'long the big road, ma'am," suggested Julius. "But I know about the flowers on the short road, and they are the ones I want." We drove down the lane to the highway, and soon struck into the short road leading past the mineral spring. Our route lay partly through a swamp, and on each side the dark, umbrageous foliage, unbroken by any clearing, lent to the road solemnity, and to the air a refreshing coolness. About half a mile from the house, and about halfway to the mineral spring, we stopped at the tree of which my wife had spoken, and reaching up to the low-hanging boughs, I gathered a dozen of the fragrant white flowers. When I resumed my seat in the rockaway, Julius started the mare. She went on for a few rods, until we had reached the edge of a branch crossing the road, when she stopped short. "Why did you stop, Julius?" I asked. "I didn't, suh," he replied. "'Twas de mare stop. Get 'long dere, Lucy. What you mean by dis foolishness?" Julius jerked the reins and applied the whip lightly, but the mare did not stir. "Perhaps you had better get down and lead her," I suggested. "If you get her started, you can cross on the log and keep your feet dry." Julius alighted, took hold of the bridle, and vainly essayed to make the mare move. She planted her feet with even more evident obstinacy. "I don't know what to make of this," I said. "I have never known her to balk before. Have you, Julius?" "No, suh," replied the old man. "I neber has. It's a cur'ous thing to me, suh." "What's the best way to make her go?" "I 'spects, suh, dat ef I'd turn her roun', she'd go de other way." "But we want her to go this way." "Well, suh, I 'low ef we jes' set here fer 5 minutes, she'll start up by herself." "All right," I rejoined. "It is cooler here than any place I have struck to day. We'll let her stand for a while, and see what she does." We had sat in silence for a few minutes, when Julius suddenly ejaculated, "Uh-huh, I knows why dis mare don't go. It jes' flashed 'cross my recommembrance." "Why is it, Julius?" I inquired. "'Cause she sees Chloe." "Where is Chloe?" I demanded. "Chloe done be'n dead dese 40 years or mo'," the old man returned. "Her ha'nt is settin' ober yonder on de other side er de branch, under dat willer tree, dis blessed minute." "Why, Julius," said my wife, "do you see the haunt?" "No'm," he answered, shaking his head, "I don't see her, but de mare sees her." "How do you know?" I inquired. "Well, suh, dis yer is a gray hoss, en dis yer is a Friday, en a gray hoss can alluz see a haunt w'at walks on Friday." "Who is Chloe?" said Mabel. "And why does Chloe's haunt walk?" asked my wife. "It's all in de tale, ma'am," Julius replied, with a deep sigh. "It's all in de tale." "Tell us the tale," I said. "Perhaps by the time you get through, the haunt will go away and the mare will cross." I was willing to humor the old man's fancy. He had not told us a story for some time, and the dark and solemn swamp around us, the amber colored stream flowing silently and sluggishly at our feet, like the waters of Lethe, the heavy aromatic scent of the bays faintly suggestive of funeral wreaths, all made the place an ideal one for a ghost story. "Chloe," Julius began in a subdued tone, "used to belong to ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo, my ole marster. She was a lackly gal and a smart gal, and ole Miss tuk her up to de big house and l'arnt her to wait on de w'ite folks, till bimeby she come to be Missus' own maid, and 'peared to 'low she run de house herself, to hear her talk about it. I was a young boy den, and used to work 'bout de stables, so I knowed eve'ything dat wuz gwine on roun' de plantation. Well, one time Mars Dugal' wanted a house boy, and sont down to de quarters fer to hab Jeff and Hannibal come up to de big house nex' mornin'. Ole marster and ole miss looked de 2 boys ober, and 'scussed wid derselves fer a little w'ile, en den Mars Dugal' sezee, 'We lacks Hannibal de bes', en we gwine keep 'im. Hey, Hannibal, you'll wuk at de house fum now on, en ef you a good nigger en minds yo' business, I'll give you Chloe fer a wife nex' spring. You other nigger, you, Jeff, you kin go back to de quarters, we ain' gwine ter need you.' Now Chloe had be'n standin' dere behin' ole Miss doin' all dis yer talk, en Chloe made up her min' fum de ve'y fus minute she sot eyes on dem two dat she didn' like dat nigger Hannibal, en wa'n't neber gwine ter keer fer 'im, en she wuz des ez sho' dat she liked Jeff, en wuz gwine ter set sto' by 'im, whether Mars Dugal' tuk 'im in de big house er no. En so, co'se Chloe was monstrous sorry when old Mars Dugal took Hannibal and sent Jeff back. So she slipped round the house and waylaid Jeff on the way back to the quarters and told him not to be downhearted, for she was going to see if she couldn't find some way or another to get rid of that nigger Hannibal and get Jeff up to the house in his place. The new houseboy cotch on monstrous fast, and it wasn't no time hardly before Mars Dugal and old Miss both commenced to allow Hannibal was the best houseboy they ever had. He was pert and supple, quick as lightning, and sharp as a razor. But Chloe didn't like his ways. He was so sure he was going to get her in the spring that it didn't appear to allow he had to do any courting. And when he'd run across Chloe about the house, he'd swell around her in a bigoted way and say, "Come here and kiss me, honey. You're going to be mine in the spring. You don't appear to be as fond of me as you ought to be." Chloe didn't care nothing for Hannibal, and hadn't cared nothing for him, and she sot just as much store by Jeff as she did the day she first laid eyes on him. And the more familiar this here Hannibal got, the more Chloe let her mind run on Jeff. And one evening she went down to the quarters and watched till she got a chance for to talk with him by herself. And she told Jeff for to go down and see old Aunt Peggy, the Conjure woman down by the Wilmington Road, and ask her to give him something to help get Hannibal out in the big house, so the white folks would send for Jeff again. And being as Jeff didn't have nothing to give Aunt Peggy, Chloe got him a silver dollar and a silk handkerchief for to pay her with, for Aunt Peggy never liked to work for nobody for nothing. So Jeff slipped off down to Aunt Peggy's one night and gun her the present he brung her, and told her all about him and Chloe and Hannibal, and asked her to help him out. Aunt Peggy told him she'd work her roots, and for him to come back the next night, and she'd tell him what she could do for him. So the next night Jeff went back, and Aunt Peggy got him a baby doll with a body made out in a piece of cornstalk, and with splinters for arms and legs, and a head made out in elderberry pith, and 2 little red peppers for feet. "This here baby doll," says she, "is Hannibal. This here pith head is Hannibal's head, and these here pepper feet is Hannibal's feet. You take this and hide it under the house, on the sill under the door, where Hannibal have to walk over it every day. And as long as Hannibal comes anywhere near this baby doll, he'll be just like it is, lightheaded and hot-footed. And if them 2 things don't get him into trouble mighty soon, then I'm no conjure woman. But when you get Hannibal back out in the house, and get all through with this baby doll, you must fetch it back to me, for it's monstrous powerful goofer, and is liable to make more trouble if you leave it laying around." Well, Jeff took the baby doll and slipped up to the big house and whistled to Chloe, and when she come out he told her what old Aunt Peggy had said, and Chloe showed him how to get under the house, and when he had put the conjure doll on the sill, he went along back to the quarters and just waited. Next day, sure enough, the goofer commenced to work. Hannibal started in the house soon in the morning with an armful of wood to make a fire, and he hadn't more than got across the door sill before his feet begun to burn, so that he dropped the armful of wood on the floor and woke old Miss up an hour sooner than usual, and 'course old Miss didn't like that and spoke sharp about it. When dinner time come, and Hannibal was helping to cook care of the dinner from the kitchen into the big house, and was getting close to the door where he had to go in, his feet started to burn, and his head began to swim, and it let the big dish of chicken and dumplings fall right down in the dirt, in the middle of the yard, and the white folks had to make their dinner that day off in cold ham and sweet taters. The next morning he overslept himself, and got into more trouble. After breakfast, Mars Dugal sent him over to Mars Marrable Utley's for to borrow a monkey wrench. He ought to been back in half an hour, but he come poking home about dinner time with a screwdriver instead of a monkey wrench. Mars Dugal sent another nigger back with the screwdriver, and Hannibal didn't get no dinner. Along in the afternoon, old Miss sought Hannibal to weedin' the flowers in the front garden, and Hannibal dug up all the bulbs old Miss had sent away for, and paid a lot of money for, and took 'em down to the hog pen by the barnyard and fed 'em to the hogs. When old Miss come out in the cool of the evening and seed what Hannibal had done, she was most crazy, and she wrote a note and sent Hannibal down to the overseer with it. But what Hannibal got from the overseer didn't 'pear to do no good. Every now and den his feet 'd 'mence to torment him, and his mind 'd get all mixed up, and his conduct keep getting worser and worser, till finally the white folks couldn't stand it no longer, and Mars Dugal took Hannibal back down to the quarters. "Mrs. Smith," says Mars Dugal to the overseer, "dis yer nigger is done got so triflin' here lately dat we can't keep him in the house no more, and I's fotch him to you to be straighten' up. You's had 'casion to deal wid him once, so he knows what to expect. You jes' take him in hand and lemme know how he turns out. And when the hands come in from the field this evenin', you can send that yeller nigger Jeff up to the house. I'll try him and see if he's any better than Hannibal." So Jeff went up to the big house and pleased Mars Dugal and ole Miss and the rest of the family so well that they all got to lacking him fust rate, and they'd 'a' forgot all 'bout Hannibal if it hadn't been for the bad reports what come up from the quarters 'bout him for a month or so. Fac' is dat Chloe and Jeff was so interested in one another since Jeff been up to the house dat they forgot all about taking the baby doll back to Aunt Peggy, and it kept working for a while and making Hannibal's feet burn more or less, till all the folks on the plantation got to calling him Hotfoot Hannibal. He kept getting mo' and mo' triflin', till he got the name of being the most no-countest nigger on the plantation, and Mars Dugal had to threaten to sell him in the spring, when by the goofer quit working, and Hannibal commenced to pick up some and make folks set a little mo' store by him. Now dis yer Hannibal was a monstrous smart nigger, and when he got rid of them soft feet, his mind kept running on his other troubles. Here 3 or 4 weeks before, he'd had a easy job waiting on the white folks, living off in the fat of the land, and promised the finest gal on the plantation for a wife in the spring, and now here he was back in the cornfield, with the overseer cussing and a raring if he didn't get a hard task done, with nothing but cornbread and bacon and molasses to eat, and all the field hands making remarks and poking fun at him 'cause he'd been sent back from the big house to the field, and the more Hannibal studied about it, the more madder he got, till he finally swore he was going to get even with Jeff and Chloe if it was the last act. So Hannibal slipped away from the quarters one Sunday and hid in the corn, up close to the big house, till he see Chloe going down the road. He waylaid her, and says he, "Howdy, Chloe." "I ain't got no time for the fool with field hands," says Chloe, tossing her head. "What you want with me, Hotfoot?" "I wants to know how you and Jeff is getting along." "I 'lows that's none of yo' business, nigger. I don't see what 'casion any common field hand has got to mix in wid the affairs of folks what lives in the big house. But if it'll do you any good to know, I might say that me and Jeff is getting along mighty well, and we going to get married in the spring. And you ain't going to be invited to the wedding, nuther." "No, no," says he, "I wouldn't 'spect to be invited to the wedding, a common low-down field hand like I is. But I's glad to hear you and Jeff is getting along so well. I didn't know but what he had commenced to be a little tired." "Tired of me? That's ridiculous," says Chloe. "Why, that nigger lusts me so, I believe he'd go through fire and water for me. That nigger is just wrop up in me." "Uh-huh," says Hannibal. "Then I reckon there must be some other nigger what meets a woman down by the crick in the swamp every Sunday evening, to say nothing about 2 or 3 times a week." "Yes, it is another nigger, and you is a liar when you say it was Jeff." "Maybe I is a liar, and maybe I ain't got good eyes. But lessen I is a liar, and lessen I ain't got good eyes, Jeff is going to meet dat woman this evening, 'long 'bout 8 o'clock, right down there by the crick in the swamp, 'bout halfway betwixt this plantation and Mars Marrabo Utley's." Well, Chloe told Hannibal she didn't believe a word he said, and called him a low-down nigger who was trying to slander Jeff 'cause he was more lucky 'n he was. But all the same, she couldn't keep her mind from running on what Hannibal had said. She 'membered she'd heard one of the niggers say there was a gal over at Mars Marrabo Utley's plantation what Jeff used to go with some before he got 'quainted with Chloe. Then she commenced to figure back, and sure enough there was 2 or 3 times in the last week when she'd been helping the ladies with their dressing and other fixings in the evening, and Jeff might have gone down to the swamp without her knowing about it at all. And then she commenced to remember little things which she had took no notice of before,
and what'd make it appear like Jeff had something on his mind. Chloe set a monstrous heap of store by Jeff, and would have done most anything for him, so long as he stuck to her. But Chloe was a mighty jealous woman, and while she didn't believe what Hannibal said, she see how it could have been so, and she determined to find out for herself whether it was so or no. Now, Chloe hadn't seen Jeff all day, for Mars Dugal had sent Jeff over to his daughter's house, young Miss Margaret's, what lived about 4 miles from Mars Dugal's, and Jeff wasn't expected home till evening. But just after supper was over, and whiles the ladies was setting out on the piazza, Chloe slip off from the house and run down the road, this here the same road we come. And when she got most to the crick, this here same crick right before us, she kind of kept in the bushes at the side of the road, till finally she seed Jeff sitting on the bank on the other side of the crick, right under that old willow tree dropping over the water yonder. And every now and then he'd get up and look up the road towards Mars Maribel's on the other side of the swamp. First, Chloe felt like she'd go right over the crick and give Jeff a piece of her mind. Then she 'lowed she better be sure before she done anything. So she held herself in best she could, getting madder and madder every minute, till by and by she seed a woman coming down the road on the other side from towards Mars Maribel Utley's plantation. And when she seed Jeff jump up and run towards that woman and throw his arms round her neck, po' Chloe didn't stop to see no more, but just turned round and run up to the house, and rush up on the piazza, and up and told Mars Dugal and ole Miss all about the baby doll, and all about Jeff getting a gopher from Aunt Peggy, and about what the gopher had done to Hannibal. Mars Dugal was monstrous mad. He didn't let on at first like he believed Chloe, but when she took and showed him where to find the baby doll, Mars Dugal turned white as chalk. "What devil's work is this?" says he. "No wonder the po' nigger's feet itched. Something got to be done to learnt that old witch to keep her hands off my niggers. And as for this here Jeff, I'm going to do just what I promised, so the darkies on this plantation'll know I means what I says." For Mars Dugal had warned the hands before about fooling with conjuration. Fact, he had lost 1 or 2 niggers himself from they being goofed, and he would have had old Aunt Peggy whipped long ago, only Aunt Peggy was a free woman, and he was feared she'd conjure him. And whilst Mars Dugal say he didn't believe in conjuring and such, he 'peared to allow it was best to be on the safe side, and let Aunt Peggy alone. So Mars Dugal done just as he say. If ole Miss had plead for Jeff, he might have kept him, but ole Miss hadn't got over losing them bulbs yet, and she never said a word. Mars Dugal took Jeff to town next day and sold him to a speculator, who started down the river with him next morning on a steamboat for to take him to Alabama. Now, when Chloe told old Mars Dugal about this here baby doll and this other goofer, she hadn't hardly 'lowed Mars Dugal would sell Jeff down south. Howsomever, she was so mad with Jeff that she swaded herself she didn't care, and so she held her head up and went round looking like she was real glad about it. But one day she was walking down the road, when who should come along but this here Hannibal. When Hannibal seed her, he bust out laughing fitting for to kill. "Yah, yah, yah, ho, 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 ha, ha, ha. Oh, hold me, honey, hold me. I'll laugh myself to death. I ain't never laughed so much since I been born." "What you laughing at, Hotfoot?" "Yeah, yeah, yeah, what I laughing at? Why, I's laughing at myself, to be sure. Laughing to think what a fine woman I made." Chloe turned pale, and her heart come up in her mouth. "What you mean, nigger?" says she, catching holt of a bush by the road for to steady herself. "What you mean by the kind of woman you made?" "What do I mean? I means that I got squared up with you for treating me the way you done, and I got even with that yeller nigger, Jeff, for cutting me out. Now he's going to know what it is to eat cornbread and molasses once more, and work from daylight to dark, and to have a overseer driving him from one day's end to the other. I means that I sent word to Jeff that Sunday that you was going to be over to Mars Maribel's visiting that evening, and you want him to meet you down by the crick on the way home and go the rest of the road with you. And then I put on a frock and a sunbonnet, and fixed myself up to look like a woman, and when Jeff seed me comin', he run to meet me, and you seed him, for I'd been a watchin' in the bushes befo' and 'scovered you comin' down the road. And now I reckon you and Jeff both knows what it means to mess with a nigger like me.' Po' Chloe hadn't heared mo' d'n half of the last part of what Hannibal said, but she had heared enough to learnt dat dis nigger had fooled her and Jeff, and dat po' Jeff hadn't done nuffin, and dat for lovin' her too much and goin' to meet her, she had caused him to be sole away, where she'd neber see him no mo'. De sun mought shine by day, de moon by night, de flowers mought bloom, en de mockin'birds mought sing, but po' Jeff was done los' to her foreber en foreber." Hannibal hadn't more than finished what he had to say when Chloe's knees gun away on her, and she fell down in the road and lay there half an hour or so before she come to. When she did, she crep' up to the house just as pale as a ghost. And for a month or so she crawled round the house and 'peared to be so po'ly dat Mars Dugal' sont for a doctor, and the doctor kep' on axin' her questions till he found she was just pinin' away for Jeff. When he tole Mars Dugal', Mars Dugal' laughed and said he fix dat. She could hab de new house boy for a husban'. But ole Miss say no, Chloe ain't dat kind of gal, and dat Mars Dugal' should buy Jeff back. So Mars Dugal' writ a letter to dis here speculator down to Wilmington, and tole if he ain't sold dat nigger South what he bought from him, he'd lack to buy him back again. Chloe commenced to pick up a little when ole Miss tole about dis letter. Howsomever, by Mars Dugal' got an answer from the speculator, who said he was monst'us sorry, but Jeff had fell overboard or jump off'n a steamboat on the way to Wilmington and got drowned, and 'cause he couldn't sell him back, much as he'd like to bleedge Mars Dugal'. Well, after Chloe heard dis, she wa'n't much mo' use to nobody. She purtended to do her work, and ole Miss put up wid her, and had the doctor give her medicine, and let her go to the circus and all sorts of things fer to take her mind off'n her troubles, but they didn't none of 'em do no good. Chloe got to slippin' down here in the evenin' jes' like she 'uz comin' to meet Jeff, and she set there under dat willer tree on the udder side and wait for 'im night atter night. Bimeby she got so bad de white folks sont her ober to young Miss Margaret's fer to gib her a change, but she runned away de fus' night, and when dey looked for her de nex' mornin', dey foun' her corpse layin' in de branch yonder, right 'cross fum whar we settin' now. Eber sence den," said Julius in conclusion, "Chloe's ha'nt comes eve'y evenin' and sits down under dat willer tree and waits fer Jeff er else walks up and down de road yonder, lookin' and waitin' fer a sweetheart w'at ain't neber eber come back ter her no mo'." There was silence when the old man had finished, and I am sure I saw a tear in my wife's eye, and more than one in Mabel's. "I think, Julius," said my wife, after a moment, "that you may turn the mare around and go by the long road." The old man obeyed with alacrity, and I noticed no reluctance on the mare's part. "You are not afraid of Chloe's haunt, are you?" I asked jocularly. My mood was not responded to, and neither of the ladies smiled. "Oh, no," said Annie, "but I've changed my mind. I prefer the other route." When we had reached the main road, and had proceeded along it for a short distance, we met a cart driven by a young negro, and on the cart were a trunk and a valise. We recognized the man as Malcolm Murchison's servant, and drew up a moment to speak to him. "Who's going away, Marshal?" I inquired. "Young Mr. Malcolm gone away on de boat to New York dis evenin', suh, and I'm taking his things down to de wharf, suh." This was news to me, and I heard it with regret. My wife looked sorry, too, and I could see that Mabel was trying hard to hide her concern. "He's comin' 'long behind, suh, and I 'spects she'll meet him up the road a piece. He's gwine ter walk down as fur as Mr. Jim Williams's, and take de buggy from dere to town. He 'spects ter be gone a long time, suh, and say prob'ly he ain't never comin' back." The man drove on. There were few words exchanged in an undertone between my wife and Mabel, which I did not catch. Then Annie said, "Julius, you may stop the rockaway a moment. There are some trumpet flowers by the road there that I want. Will you get them for me, John?"
I sprang into the underbrush, and soon returned with a great bunch of scarlet blossoms. "Where is Mabel?" I asked, noting her absence. "She has walked on ahead. We shall overtake her in a few minutes." The carriage had gone only a short distance when my wife discovered that she had dropped her fan. "I had it where we were stopping. Julius, will you go back and get it for me?" Julius got down and went back for the fan. He was an unconscionably long time finding it. After we got started again, we had gone only a little way when we saw Mabel and young Murchison coming toward us. They were walking arm in arm, and their faces were aglow with the light of love. I do not know whether or not Julius had a previous understanding with Malcolm Murchison by which he was to drive us round by the long road that day, nor do I know exactly what motive influenced the old man's exertions in the matter. He was fond of Mabel, but I was old enough and knew Julius well enough to be skeptical of his motives. It is certain that a most excellent understanding existed between him and Murchison after the reconciliation, and that when the young people set up housekeeping over at the old Murchison place, Julius had an opportunity to enter their service. For some reason or other, however, he preferred to remain with us. The mare, I might add, was never known to balk again. End of Hotfoot Hannibal. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell Chesnutt.